Forest mysteries.
The trail had been narrowing for the last 2 miles, pressing in from both sides until the spruce branches scraped his shoulders with every step. Stephen Colden didn't mind. He'd walked this route enough times that his legs knew it without consulting him where to step wide to clear the route, where to duck under the low-hanging pine, where the ground dropped suddenly into a shallow gully that caught snow in early fall and ice by November. He knew all of it. That was the point. He came over the last ridge at 4:15, and the light was already going. In late October in the Montana backcountry, afternoon didn't linger. It just fell away, the sky going from pale gray to something darker and denser while you were still watching it. The trees on the far slope were already black outlines. The clearing below was white. The cabin sat at the edge of that clearing, backed against a wall of old spruce the way it always had. Small, squared off, built by someone with no patience for anything unnecessary. One room, one window facing south, a stovepipe angled out through the roof. Stephen had spent 8 winters here, and every time he came over that ridge, his chest loosened slightly the way it did when you set down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten you had it. He stopped. Something was wrong. He stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at the cabin for a long moment without moving. The door was shut. The stovepipe was cold, no smoke, which was right. He hadn't been here since March. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed except for a line of animal tracks cutting diagonally across the clearing, probably deer already half buried from last night. Nothing moved, but the latch was off. He could see it from 30 feet away. The small iron bar that should have been seated across the door brackets was hanging at an angle, the way a latch hangs when the bracket holding one end has been forced, not broken off. Forced, there was a difference. Stephen had installed that latch himself 6 years ago, and he knew exactly what it looked like when it was seated right. It wasn't seated right. He stood still and listened to the trees for a full minute before he walked down. The snow around the cabin step was older too. Maybe 3 days of wind had softened whatever had been there. But under the step's overhang, where the wind didn't reach, he could see the edge of a boot print. Rubber sole, wide toe box. Not his. He wore lace-up leather boots with a lug sole, and he knew their print the way a man knows his own handwriting. This was something else. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stood in the frame. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold and something else, something faintly damp, like wet wood left to dry in a closed space. His gear was not where he left it. The 2 folded canvas bags he'd hung on the far wall were on the floor. The metal shelf above the stove, where he kept the lighter, the small coil of wire, the spare lantern globe had been swept, not knocked. The things on it were grouped to one side, not scattered. Someone had looked through them. Carefully, but not carefully enough. Stephen set his pack down just inside the door and stood without taking off his coat. The smell bothered him more than the mess. It was the damp wood smell, heavy in clothes, the kind of smell that lived in old buildings where the air didn't move. He'd smelled it before, in a different building, in a different context entirely. And his mind made the connection before he could stop at the hallway of the hospital in Billings, the 3rd floor. The stretch of corridor where the overhead lighted flickered every few seconds, while he sat in a plastic chair outside room 318 and waited for news that didn't come. He crossed the room in 3 steps and opened the window. The cold air came in hard and the smell thinned. He stood at the window for a moment with his hands on the sill, breathing the outside air, looking at nothing in particular. Then he turned around and got to work. The bracket on the latch had been bent at the bolt. He needed to reset it with the small hammer and punch he kept in the bottom of his pack. The gap in the wall was worse than he'd expected, near the floor on the north side, where a log had been slowly working loose for 3 winters. It had finally given enough to leave a space 2 fingers wide, cold enough to matter. He'd need to pack it with oakum and nail a board over it before the temperature dropped hard, which, by the feel of the air coming through, was going to be soon. He lit the lantern first. The orange light spread across the log walls and the ceiling, warm and dense, and the cabin stopped looking like a crime scene. and started looking like what it was, a small functional room that someone had been careless in. He moved through the repair work methodically, stove, bracket, gap in the wall. He found the oakum in the toolbox under the bunk and worked it into the gap with his fingers until the draft died. He nailed the board over it with 8 nails, each one set clean. The latch bracket took 20 minutes because the log it was bolted to had dried, and the bolt had worked loose, and he had to bore a new hole a 1/4 inch to the left. By the time he was done, the stove had been going for an hour, and the room was almost warm. He ate from a canned beans, heated in the pot, eaten standing over the stove, because the table still had someone else's dirt on it, and he hadn't wiped it down yet. The beans were plain into hot, and he burned the inside of his lower lip on the first spoonful, which irritated him more than it should have. He set the pot down and waited. Outside, the wind had come up. It moved through the spruce trees with a low, sustained sound, not sharp, just constant, like a machine running somewhere far away. After he ate, he cleaned the table and unpacked the rest of his gear. He did it in a specific order, the same order every year: food in the crate under the left bunk, tools in the box, ammunition on the high shelf, the rifle on the 2 hooks above the door. Familiar motions. His hands knew them. At the bottom of the main pack, wrapped in a flannel shirt to keep it flat, was the photograph. He'd packed it without thinking about it, the way you pack things that have been in a certain drawer for years, and end up in your hands without any decision being made. It was a standard-sized print, slightly faded at one corner, and their daughter Lily on the porch of the house in Whitefish, summer, both of them squinting in the sun. Lily was 4 in that photograph, holding a popsicle that had melted halfway down her wrist. Anne was laughing at something off frame. Stephen looked at it for a moment. Then he put it in the desk drawer, face down, and slid the drawer shut. He sat on the edge of the bunk in the lantern light and listened to the wind and didn't think about anything in particular for a while. The stove cracked and popped as the metal expanded in the heat. The oakum in the wall held no draft. The latch was solid. The cabin was as tight as he could make it tonight, and tomorrow he'd check the roof and the wood pile and the outhouse and the rest of it. He was almost asleep when he heard the howling. It came from the north, across the creek, somewhere in the black slope of trees above the clearing. Not close, maybe a mile, maybe a little less, but clear. A single voice rising and holding, then dropping, and then 2 more joining it, and then what sounded like the whole pack at once, layered and rough and enormous. He lay still and counted without meaning to. 5 voices, maybe 6. That was a large pack for this drainage. He'd heard wolves out here before, always smaller groups, usually passing through. This sounded like something that lived here. The howling stopped. Stephen lay in the dark with his eyes open and listened to the wind come back into the silence the wolves had left. After a while, it just sounded like wind again. He closed his eyes. He slept badly, which was normal for the first night. In the morning, while the coffee was heating, he opened the front door and stepped outside in his boot liners to check the thermometer nailed to the door frame, 21 degrees. The sky was clear and pale, and the snow in the clearing was clean and smooth, except for a set of tracks that came from the direction of the tree line, crossed the open ground, and stopped directly in front of the cabin step. Large paws, deep impression, heavy animal. The stride was long and the toes spread slightly, the way they spread when a wolf is moving slowly and placing each foot with care rather than running. The tracks stopped at the step and didn't continue. Whatever had made them had stood here for a while and then gone back the way it came. Stephen crouched and looked at the size of the print for a long moment. Then he looked up at the window at the exact angle. Something standing at the step would have looked at it and felt a slow, quiet thing move through him that he didn't have a name for. He went inside and poured his coffee and drank it at the table, facing the door. Stephen woke before the lantern burned out, not because of a sound or a dream he could put a hand on, but because his body had long ago decided that if he was in the backcountry in winter, then first light was work time, and there was no point arguing with something that deeply wired. So he lay still for a minute under the heavy blanket and listened to the stove ticking as it cooled, the faint hiss of the wind at the window, and the quiet of a place where no engines, no traffic, no other human voices existed for miles, then swung his feet to the floor and felt the cold bite up through the boards into his bare soles before he reached for his socks. He moved through the morning like a man walking inside grooves cut years before, each action already shaped by the last time and the time before that. Coffee grounds into the dented pot, water from the metal pail, the slow heating on the stove while he pulled on long underwear, wool socks, shirt and flannel, and then the thick canvas pants. The laced leather boots with the familiar tug at the tongue, and the double knot he always made, because he hated retying anything out here when his fingers were numb. Outside, the light was just a hint of pale above the black line of trees, and the thermometer at the doorframe sat a few degrees below what it had read yesterday, which meant the snow would be holding its crust, good enough for walking if he timed it right, and was back before the sun softened it into sugar. The trapline waited, and the trapline was the closest thing he had to a routine that mattered, so he checked the rifle on its hooks, slid it down, broke it open, glanced at the clean metal of the chamber and the round he slid home, then shouldered it and took his pack and stepped out into the cold that wrapped him in one hard breath, not cruel yet, just honest. The kind of cold that told you straight that you did not belong here, unless you were prepared to pay attention. He crossed the clearing with his boots crunching on the old snow that had frozen and thawed just enough times to build a brittle surface layer, past the outhouse with its tilt and the woodpile with its neat-head-high stack. That satisfied a part of him he never named and dropped down the small slope toward the creek where the world changed from the tight circle of cabin life to the white indifferent sprawl of spruce and fir and charred trunks that marked the edge of the burn. That big fire from 12 years back that had crawled over the ridge and licked through this drainage, leaving black poles and open ground that the elk loved now and the wolves followed, which made it valuable to him in a way only a man who lived by what the land offered could fully feel. He hit the first trap set just north of the creek crossing, where a game trail cut between two rocks and funneled anything with hooves or paws into a narrow choke. And before he saw the metal of the jaws, he saw the disturbed snow and the way the spruce needles nearby had been brushed clean by something moving harder than a rabbit, and his shoulders tightened. Because there is a look to a sprung trap that a man who sets them recognizes from 20 yards. The trap lay on its side, the chain stretched, the drag buried deep, the jaws closed on nothing, the bait stick gone, not even a scrap of sinew left, and in the powder that had fallen in the night, you could see the marks of careful fingers or a stick tip that had teased the meat free without ever putting weight on the pan. He knelt, not touching anything yet, eyes following the faint impressions that moved around the set, reading them the way another man might read a printed page. And what he saw was not fox or coyote or any other four-legged shape. These were prints where the snow was pressed in longer ovals, a flat surface with edges from a molded sole. The repeating pattern in sight already blurred by drift, but still clear enough that he could see the diagonal lines of a rubber tread and the wider heel area that said insulated boot rather than the slim leather ones hikers favored in summer. The size was close to his own, maybe a little broader, somewhat not small, and as he turned his head, found the exit track heading downstream, paralleling his line, and he felt his jaw clench in that old tired way that had nothing to do with fear of a particular man and everything to do with the knowledge that is winter, which had been planned as a conversation between him and the weather and the animals and his own thoughts, now had a third party in it. He reset the trap because not resetting it would have felt too much like leaving a door open, scraped out the bed, tamped the chain, placed the pan, packed the snow back over with a gloved hand until the surface looked untouched, fixed a new bait stick with a piece of dried meaty cut from his pocket supply, then stood and looked again at the broad soft marks that led down along the creek, thinking the way he always did when something disrupted his pattern. What does this cost? What does it give? What does it mean for the days ahead? The second and third traps told the same story with just enough variation to keep his mind churning. At the bend where the creek narrowed under leaning alders, the set meant for mink had been carefully lifted and laid aside, the wire bent slightly out of true, as if someone had handled it with cold fingers, and more interest in speed than finesse, the bait gone once more. And on this small rise beyond, where he kept a heavier trap for bobcat under the overhang of a fallen log. The jaws were sprung and the chain twisted in the snow around it, a confusion of footprints, both animal and human, overlapping so that he had to crouch for a long time, scanning for the details that might matter later. A cat had circled the shed and backed off. The man had stepped in close, knelt, done his work, backed out, then stood in one place for a while, the repeated stamp of his boots grinding the pattern deep, maybe thinking, maybe just breathing and looking the way Stephen himself sometimes did, when he was alone with no particular need to be moving. By the time he straightened, his legs had begun to ache from the cold seeping through his pants at the knees, and he knew he needed to move if he wanted his body to stay one step ahead of the air. So he climbed the low bank and took the track the stranger had left, not because he intended to follow it all the way, but because he needed to see where it tended. The trail wound through a stand of younger fir, their trunks still thin and flexible from the regrowth after the fire, and after a quarter mile, the ground opened into the main stretch of the burn, where blackened snags rose out of the snow like the ribs of some huge carcass, and the sky above felt wider, the light harsher, the wind finding him more easily. Now that there was less to break it, he could smell the burn before he saw it. Even under the clean edge of winter, there was always a faint ghosted hint of char in the soil there, especially when the sun warmed it, and today the smell met him as he stepped into the open, mixing with the metallic tang of cold air and the distant resin of unburned spruce at the edges, and it made him think uninvited of the first year after the fire, when he had walked through here with Anne before everything went bad. The two of them picking their way between stumps, her saying that one day this place would be green again and they ought to come back and see it, and how he had nodded without really listening, because he had been watching a hawk circle overhead and thinking about Elk's sign. Now the boot prints crossed the open ground in a straight, efficient line, not zigzagging for curiosity or strolling, and as he followed them with his eyes, not his feet, he saw where they turned, angling away toward the distant notch in the ridge that he knew, from years of maps and walking, led eventually to another drainage, and beyond that, if a man was stubborn enough, to the gravel road that locals used to get to the next county. Whoever this was, he was cutting through, not wandering, but he was cutting through in a way that took him closer, not farther, to where Stephen knew the wolves liked to run that time of year, the main game trails carved into the snow by elk and deer, as they used the open burned slopes as cautious feeding grounds. He stood there in the middle of the black stumps and white snow and felt something move in his stomach that was not hunger and not quite anger, a slow, reluctant tightening that came whenever other people pried open the life he had sealed back down after Billings. He could admit, at least to himself out here where no one could hear it, that the idea of another man working the same ground, touching the same traps, watching the same animals, made him feel like someone was reaching into his pockets and handling his things. Not because he owned the land he knew better than that, but because solitude, for him, had become a sort of property. Something he invested in until it felt like it belonged to him more than the house in Whitefish ever had. On the way back, he took a different path, cutting higher along the slope to sweep his eyes over the snowy folds and tree lines he'd walked for years, looking not so much for the man now, as for any sign that the wolves were closer than they had sounded last night, and as the sun finally pushed weak light through the thin cloud. The open patch of the burn ahead brightened until the snow there looked almost hard enough to cut your hand on it, and for a moment he had to squint against the glare, the landscape flattening into white and gray and charcoal, stripped of depth. He saw her then. At first she was just another piece of that gray of vertical smudge against the background of dark trunks, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized he was looking at a large animal standing at the far edge of the open ground, perfectly still, the wind quartering from her to him, so that whatever scent he carried reached her long before he picked out the details of her shape. The legs were long, the chest deep, the head narrow, and even at that distance he could tell that this was no coyote, no stray dog from a ranch down the valley. The proportions were wrong for anything but a wolf, and not a yearling either, but a full-grown adult with the easy vertical stillness of a creature that knows exactly where it stands in its own world. Her coat was mottled gray and off-white, the kind of pelt that would fetch a good price if a man was thinking along those lines, though he never had about wolves because the regulations were tight and the work rarely worth it, and she held herself with a calm that was almost human in its patience, head turned just enough that he could feel on some deep animal level that her eyes were on him even if he could not see them clearly. They were close enough that if he called out, his voice would carry, but far enough that he could pretend, if he needed to, that this was a coincidence, that hunter and hunted and whatever other roles they might be playing had just intersected by chance. He did not move. The rifle hung by its sling against his shoulder, a familiar weight he had never been shy about using on deer or elk, or even the occasional bear that came too close to his winter meat. Yet in that moment, the idea of lifting it felt as distant and abstract as those days in the hospital when time had slowed into a viscous, useless thing, and every movement felt like betrayal. He and the wolf looked at each other across the open scar of the burn, the wind folding between them with its faint charred smell and the high, almost metallic whistle it made when it slipped past the dead branches. And the space seemed to stretch not in distance, but in some other measure he did not have words for, something like recognition or challenge or a shared wordless understanding. That both of them were here by choice and by necessity at the same time. After a while he could not have said whether it was 5 seconds or 50 she turned, not with any show of alarm, just a smooth economical pivot of her body, and walked away along the line of the trees, her paws placing in the prints of whatever wolf had led the pack along that route last time, her tail level, her head low, until the trunk swallowed her. And the gray shape became part of the forest again, leaving him standing alone in the cold, bright space with the black stumps and the cracked snow, feeling, against his will, that something had shifted slightly inside him, not enough to name, just enough that the world did not sit exactly where it had when he walked out of the cabin that morning. On the way back down toward the creek and the cabin, the air grew colder as the sun slid behind the thin band of cloud that had been hanging on the western ridge, and his stomach reminded him that he had eaten nothing since the beans the night before. But the thought that stayed closest was not about food or what are the stranger's boot prints. It was a quieter, more unsettling awareness that the backcountry was not an empty stage he moved across alone, but a place where other wills, human and not, moved on their own paths, and for a man who had come out here to get away from the press of other lives, that was both a comfort and an irritation he could not yet sort out. By the time the sun had made its slow, shallow climb over the ridge and begun its equally shallow slide back down, the cabin had settled into the rhythm Stephen wanted for it, the stove breathing steady heat into the single room, the damp smell gone, replaced by the mix of dry wood, coffee grounds, and the faint familiar tang of gun oil from the rifle on its hooks. And he had started to feel once again that this place existed slightly sideways from the rest of the world. Not entirely out of it, but close enough that phone calls and bills and everything that had turned life into a series of sharp little obligations felt like something that had happened to another man. He had mended the last of the loose chinking between two logs, stacked the remaining kindling by the stove in a neat column, eaten a late lunch of jerky and stale crackers, and was halfway through the act of reaching for the coffee pot again, when he heard the crunch of footsteps on the hard crust outside, the sound too heavy and regular for any animal he recognized as harmless. He froze with his hand on the pot handle, not because he was scared in the way people from town sometimes imagined you would be out here with no one around, but because he had lived long enough in wild places to know that stillness buys you a moment to listen, and a moment to listen can be the difference between walking towards something and backing quietly away from it. The footsteps came closer, not hurried, not trying to be light, just the steady, unbothered tread of a man who either did not know that anyone was here or knew it very well, and had decided that the best way to arrive was like someone who belonged. There was a brief pause outside the door, the small silence that falls when a person adjusts a pack strap or wipes a glove on their pants before knocking. Then 3 measured blows of knuckles on wood, firm enough to be heard over the stove in the wind, not so loud as to be rude. Stephen set the pot back on the stove, wiped his hand on his thigh, and crossed the few steps to the door, feeling that tightness in his jaw again, the one that had started when he found the bent latch and the strange boot print, and had not quite gone away, even as he nailed new boards and tamped gaps. He opened the door without saying anything, letting the outside air push past him in a cold, brief gust that smelled of snow and spruce, and the faint, oily scent of another man who had been traveling underweight. On the steps stood a figure wrapped in a dark parka, the hood pushed back enough to show a narrow, weathered face that had been carved over time into planes and lines by wind and sun, the skin dark from exposure, the stubble on his jaw gone gray, eyes the washed-out blue you saw sometimes in men who had spent too many winters squinting into glare. The stranger's pack was heavy, straps biting into his shoulders through the thick fabric, and a rifle hung from a sling across his chest, the barrel tipped politely downward, not in a theatrical show of harmlessness, but in the automatic way of someone who had spent his life around other armed men and understood without thinking the language a muzzle could speak, even when it was silent. Afternoon, the man said, his voice low and rough-edged, as if the cold had sanded it down. Wasn't sure anyone kept this place in winter. Stephen looked at him for a beat, taking in the details that mattered, the boots with rubber bottoms and leather uppers, the scuff marks that lined them, the way his gloves were worn at the fingers, hinting at long use rather than new gear bought for a single trip, the leather of the rifle sling dark from sweat and oil. This was not a tourist who had wandered off a marked trail. This was someone who lived in the same country he did and understood what it cost. Somebody does, Stephen said, finally, the words coming out slow but even. You lost. The corner of the man's mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile if there had been more warmth in it. Turned around more than lost, he replied. Got up the wrong draw in the dark yesterday and kept telling myself it'd make sense come daylight. Daylight had other ideas. Name's Earl. Backcountry etiquette was a strange blend of suspicion and generosity, rules no one had written down, but everyone who lasted long enough out here knew. You did not turn away a man who said he was off his line when the snow was on, and the temperatures dropped like a rock once the sun left. Not unless you wanted that man's ghost on your conscience, when spring melt carried his bones out of some side canyon. And at the same time, you never fully put down the knowledge that a stranger with a gun, and a reason you did not know for being here, could take everything you had in a minute if he chose to. Stephen stepped back from the doorway, opening the space with a small motion of his hand. Come in, he said. Warm up. Earl moved past him with the careful, compact steps of a man whose joints had seen enough miles that every motion counted, unslinging his pack in one smooth, practiced shift of his shoulders, so that it dropped just inside the door, not blocking the way, not crowding the room more than it had to. As he removed his gloves and rubbed his hands together briskly, blowing into them once, Stephen watched the way his eyes flicked around the cabin, not nosy, exactly, but cataloging bunk, stove, table, shelves, rifle hooks, the drawer under the table, where a man might keep maps. It was the same sort of quick, efficient scan Stephen himself did whenever he stepped into an unfamiliar space out here, and seeing someone else do it in his made the skin between his shoulder blades itch. The warmth from the stove hit Earl's face, bringing a little color into the skin, and he made a small appreciative sound deep in his throat. That could have been sincere or just something he had learned to say when stepping into whoever's shelter he found. Stephen poured coffee into the second chipped mug he owned, the one that had not been used by anybody but him in years, and handed it over without ceremony, watching the man's fingers close around it, knuckles knobby, nails trimmed close. Earl took a careful sip, closed his eyes for half a beat, then opened them again and nodded, more to himself than to Stephen. "Figure I owe you one," he said. "You running a line out here or just hiding from the world?" Stephen shrugged, the motion small, almost hidden under his flannel. "Bit of both," he answered. "Got mink sets up the creek, a few cat traps in the burn, enough to make the weeks mean something. Cabin's mine." Mine, in that sentence, had less to do with legal papers in any courthouse, and more to do with time and sweat and winters endured. Earl seemed to understand, his gaze resting on the stove for a moment, on the stack of split wood neatly arranged beside it, on the patched sections of wall where the logs had been hammered back into tightness. He took another drink, then set the mug down with care, not on the bare wood of the table, but on the ring of old newspapers Stephen kept there, a small gesture that said he was used to being in other men's spaces, and not causing more trouble than he needed to. "Seen any other outfits through here this season?" Earl asked, casually, like a man making conversation about weather or game, though his eyes sharpened just a fraction as he spoke. "Figure I might have crossed somebody's sign yesterday before dark, but it was blowing pretty good, hard to tell." Stephen's mind went at once to the rubber-soled prints by his sprung traps, the careful hands that had teased out bait without tripping pans, the way the boot tracks had paralleled his line, as if following, measuring. There was a thin, interesting tension in his chest, like the feel of a wire pulled just up to its breaking point and held there, and he was aware, in a way that made his mouth dry, that this was one of those moments where future trouble either got named or left floating. "Haven't seen anyone," he said, the answer slow, not quite a lie if you defined, seen as stood face to face with, though he knew his father would have called it the same thing and frowned. "Tracks, maybe, hard to tell in the wind, like you said." Earl studied him over the rim of the mug, blue eyes steady but not hostile, as if weighing not the words but the space around them, the hesitation, the choice of what to say and what to leave unsaid. For a second, Stephen could hear Anne's voice in his memory, the way she would sometimes cut through a conversation at a dinner he had not wanted to be at, saying afterward, when it was just the two of them in the car, that people always told you who they were if you watched how they handled small truths, and that his problem was he saw it, and then pretended he hadn't, because he wanted to believe the best longer than was safe. "You been coming out here long?" Earl asked, shifting the topic slightly, leaning back in the chair so that it creaked under his weight, shoulders relaxing as the heat sank into his coat. "Cabin looks like it's had the same pair of hands on it for a while." "8 winters," Stephen replied. "Before that I was with the Forest Service. Fire crews, trail work. This place was a hunting shack back when I started. Took it over after the old boy who built it didn't come back one spring." There was a small shared understanding in Earl's nod at that last sentence, because men who spent their lives in these kinds of places knew that didn't come back, could cover everything from a heart that stopped under too much strain hauling wood to a slip on ice above an unseen ravine, and that the details mattered less than the fact that the land did not negotiate or apologize. Stephen did not say that sometimes, when the light hit the chink logs just so, he imagined that he could still see traces of the original owner's labor, faint knife marks or the way a particular notch had been cut, and that occupying another man's shelter had always felt to him like a constant reminder that one day someone else might be sitting where he was now, looking at his own decisions and the scars on the wood. "You running wolves?" Earl asked after a pause, changing tack again with that smooth, almost idle manner that did not quite hide the precision of his interest. "Heard the state up the tags on 'em this year. Folks over the ridge say there's a big pack working the draws here now, chewing up deer and elk that used to make it down to them come January." Stephen felt his fingers tight and imperceptibly on his own mug, his thoughts jumping to the tracks at his step in the morning, to the layered howls that had rolled over the cabin the night before, to the steady, unflinching gaze of the she-wolf in the burn. He could feel, like a change in weather, the direction Earl wanted this conversation to lean toward pelts and numbers and bounties, toward turning anonymous gray bodies into counted dollars, and he knew he needed to choose his path through it with more care, than he usually bothered to when winter left him talking mainly to himself. Not running wolves, he said, after a breath that he tried to make sound casual. Never had a taste for it. Enough work in fur that doesn't think about you when you close a trap on it. A flicker of something passed across Earl's face at that, not quite contempt, not quite amusement, more like the acknowledgement of a man who has heard a neighbor say he doesn't drink and files it away with a shrug, because it is a choice that neither threatens nor interests him much, except as a piece of information. He scratched at his jaw, the rasp of his nails on stubble loud in the small room, then leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Can't say I share that hesitation," he answered. "Wolf's a wolf, far as I'm concerned. Livestock guard back home says every one you take out saves you 3 calves down the line. I look at 'em and I see money, especially if someone's got pups on the ground in reach of a snare." Snow had a way of making the forest feel both smaller and larger at the same time, muffling sound until every footstep he took seemed loud enough to carry for miles, while at the same stroke revealing, in the clean white surface of the ground, the spiderweb of lives that had crossed his path long before he stepped into their lines, so that by early December, when the storms had finally settled into a pattern and the cold no longer came and went but simply stayed, Stephen found himself reading the days as much by the tracks he followed as by the thin pale strip of sky he could see through the black teeth of the spruce. He had come out that morning on a straightforward intention, one that had nothing to do, at least on its face, with wolves or men named Earl, because an elk had cut across his line 3 days before, and he had been thinking ever since about how much meat a single clean shot could hang under his eaves and how. In a winter where surprises had already begun to pile up, having that weight of flesh frozen solid outside his cabin might be the only kind of certainty he could still buy with his own hands. The elk's track had been clear when he first saw it, a deep heart-shaped print pressed into the soft snow of the creek bank. The stride long and easy, no sign of panic in the spacing, the animal moving at the unhurried pace of a creature that had not yet smelled teeth on its neck, and Stephen had marked its general direction, knowing from years of walking this country where the animal was likely to be headed, up toward a south-facing slope where the wind kept the snow thinner in the tuff. Brown grasses and shrubs would still be within reach of a hungry mouth. Now, under a sky the color of tin, with the air so still that his own breath trailed away like a small engine exhaust in front of him, he climbed toward that slope, boots biting into the crust and breaking through in places, the soft grunts of effort he made swallowed almost at once by the white silence around him. He found the trail again where he expected it, a line of prints cutting diagonally up a narrow draw between stands of spruce and fir. The edges of each hoof mark softened by 2 nights of light snow, but still readable, and falling into it gave him, in a way he would not have put into words, the comfort of purpose, because following a single line with a clear goal was easier on the mind than juggling the parallel tracks of men and wolves and memories. His rifle wrote easy on his shoulder, the weight familiar and not particularly ominous, and his thoughts wandered as he climbed. Not to the shot he might take if he found the elk in range, but to the way Earl's voice had sounded in the cabin when he talked about wolves as money, flat and factual, no malice in it, which somehow made it sit heavier in Stephen's chest, as if the absence of hatred meant the world could grind up whatever it wanted without even the courtesy of rage. The draw steepened, the trees thinned, and the snow underfoot grew deeper and less certain, falling away from the crust in soft collapses that filled his boots with fine dry crystals, and he forced himself to slow down, not out of fatigue so much as out of the knowledge, born of years of walking too quickly in dangerous country, that hurrying in snow was a good way to twist a knee, or miss a sign that meant more than his stomach's pull toward meat. The elk track angled right, then left, then right again, skirting small obstacles with the effortless efficiency of a body built for this landscape. And after another 100 yards, it shifted direction entirely, veering away from the slope he had expected, and cutting instead toward the shadowed pocket of a side basin that Stephen had seldom visited in winter. partly because it was a natural sink for cold air and windblown snow, partly because he had never had much reason to go there when better hunting lay elsewhere. He hesitated, one boot half raised, weighing the cost of following against the pull of the familiar path he had planned to take, then stepped after it, telling himself that an animal did not change direction for no reason, and that if something in that hollow drew it strongly enough, it might be worth his while to learn what that something was, rather than insist that his expectations were more accurate than the instincts of an animal that lived or died by reading the land. The basin opened slowly as he climbed a low rise and dropped down the other side, and the cold thickened in the air like a physical substance, creeping up through his pant legs and into his thighs, slipping through the seams of his coat at the shoulders, wrapping itself around his jaw until the simple act of clenching his teeth felt like grinding ice. The trees around the basin were older and taller, a stand of spruce that had somehow escaped the worst of the big fire, their trunks thick and dark, their branches sweeping low under the weight of snow, forming heavy drooping walls that turned the space beneath them into a kind of hushed green-lit cave where the light that did make it through the needles carried a strange muted quality as if it were water passing through moss. The elk tracks skirted the edge of this grove, then faded as it entered a patch of wind-scoured ground where bare earth and old leaves showed through, and Stephen stopped just inside the screen of trees, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper shadow, already thinking about where the elk might have bedded, and how to move without sending every living thing within earshot bounding away before he could even raise the rifle. Then he heard it, the sound that did not belong to elk or wind or any of the usual small voices of the forest. A short, high yipping bark, almost startled in tone, followed by another, lower, rougher, and then a series of growls and muffled thumps that, when taken together, made a picture in his mind of bodies colliding in snow, paws scrabbling, small teeth snapping in more excitement than anger. He sank down without thinking, his knees folding until he was half crouched, half kneeling in the drift at the base of a spruce, his gloved hand going automatically to steady the rifle, even as he eased it down, because some part of him understood that the next few minutes were not going to be about shooting anything. He inched forward until he could see through a thin gap between two lodded branches, careful not to brush them and send a curtain of snow down onto his own head, and the scene in the small clearing beyond, once his eyes sorted the grays and whites and shadows into separate forms, landed so hard in his chest that for a beat he simply forgot to breathe. In the center of the hollow, where the snow had been tamped flat by many comings and goings, three small shaggy shapes tumbled over one another in a tangle of limbs and fur, their bodies long and narrow, their paws outsized, their tails whipping erratically as they rolled, bit, leapt, and fell in a kind of wild, chaotic choreography that managed, despite its apparent randomness, to follow some shared rhythm like children inventing a game with rules only they understood. One of the pups, bigger than the other two, shoulders already hinting at the mass it would carry as an adult, launched himself clumsily at a sibling with a mock, ferocious snarl, only to misjudge the distance and go sprawling long ways into the snow, which puffed up around him in a fine white halo as he scrambled to right himself, shaking his head in offended surprise. The second pup, a leaner, slightly smaller creature with a reddish tint along its flanks, darted in and out along the edge of the play, snapping at ears and tails, bright with a kind of reckless curiosity that made its movements more jittery than the others, as if it could not decide whether to commit to any one action for longer than a heartbeat. The third, smallest of all, hung back a fraction, entering the tangle a moment later each time, getting knocked aside more often, his paws slipping in the same tracks the others had already made, his attempts at pouncing half a beat behind and landing with less weight, yet he kept coming, climbing back onto his brother's flank, even as he slid off, his persistence a quiet thread through the louder chaos around him. Watching them, Stephen became aware of another presence, larger, steadier at the far edge of the clearing, and his gaze slid there almost reluctantly, as if some part of him wanted to stay with the small, harmless scene of play, and not complicate it with the knowledge of what kept it possible. She stood with her weight evenly balanced on all 4 feet, head held low but not in submission, ears pricked forward, her fur a dense mottled coat of gray and off-white that blended with the snow and the tree trunks so well that if she had not been moving her head to track each pup's arc, he might have mistaken her for a shadow at first glance. Her eyes, even at this distance, caught light in a way that seemed almost metallic, and as she followed the antics of her young, there was a tension in the line of her neck and shoulders that spoke less of immediate danger and more of readiness, the kind of prepared watchfulness that comes from loving something too fragile in a world that does not care whether it survives. She was bigger than he had thought when he saw her in the burn, deeper in the chest, the muscles along her flanks visible when she shifted her weight, and the space around her felt, for reasons he could not have explained, like a kind of moving border, the line between safety and everything beyond it. The air carried a sharp musky scent that cut through the resin, and cold, the smell of predator and family layered together, and Stephen felt his throat tighten around it, not in fear so much as in some deeper reaction that had the texture of memory, though no wolves had ever stood like this in the hospital corridors where he had lost his own small unit of 3. His legs grew cold first, the snow seeping into his pants and numbing the muscles from the knees down, but he stayed where he was, half kneeling, propped by the trunk at his back, because something in him had decided that leaving this scene before it ended of its own accord would be like walking out in the middle of a confession. Time lengthened, each minute stretching thin and clear as he watched the small dramas play out in front of him, the tussles and mock battles, the moments when one pup would suddenly break away and stand still, panting, chest heaving, steam rising faintly from its mouth, only to be knocked from the side by another body, sending them both back into the whirl. He was aware, in a distant, almost clinical way, that he was too close, that there was risk in being within scent and sight of a mother wolf with pups in the open, that if the wind shifted or he made one wrong sound, he could find himself staring down a very different set of teeth, yet the rational calculation of distance and danger felt muted under a heavier, slower thought, one that had taken shape the moment he realized what he was looking at and had not yet found words that fit it. He thought of Anne holding Lily on the porch in summer, the way his daughter had loved to lean over the railing and drop small sticks into the yard, watching them fall as if gravity were a trick she might unlearn by staring hard enough, and of how, in those days, he had taken for granted that the two of them would always be there for him to come home to after fire seasons, a fixed point in a world he could leave and return to at will. Now, in the hush of the basin, with the smell of wolf and snow and cold earth in his nose, and the sound of soft, high barks and low, rumbling grunts in his ears, he felt, more than thought, that these animals had something he no longer did, not in a sentimental sense, but in the hardest, simplest terms, a present tense that was fully occupied by the demands of survival and care, rather than haunted by the echo of what had been or the question of what might be if he had done some tiny thing differently. They did not know that any day could be their last, or if they did, they knew it only in their bodies, not in the endless loop of the mind that replayed mistakes until they wore grooves in it. And for the first time in a long time, watching them, Stephen felt a small sharp stab of something like envy. He did not know how long he stayed in that cramped cold perch, but eventually the pups tired, their pace slowing, their movements losing some of their spring as they flopped down in the trampled snow near their mother, sides heaving, tongues lolling, their rough fur dusted white along the ridges where snow had stuck. Gray moved among them, sniffing, giving each a brief, thorough inspection, nudging one with her nose when it tried to climb onto her back, stepping over another with a fluid grace that kept her paws from ever coming down where a small body lay. When she finished her circuit, she lifted her head and turned slightly, and in that small shift something in the air changed, a faint ripple that his body registered before his conscious mind did. Her nose lifted, nostrils flaring, breath steaming in short bursts as she tested the currents, and Stephen felt his heart hitch, a muscle that had been beating slow and heavy, suddenly misfiring in his chest, because he knew in that instant that some thread of his scent, however faint, had found its way through the still air and across the open space to her. The pups, exhausted, did not notice, their eyes half closed, their bodies lax, but Gray's entire posture altered by degrees, her weight tilting toward him, her ears angling forward, her attention narrowing to a single point somewhere in the shadow where he knelt, and he understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with human words, that the long suspended moment of being an unseen observer was over. Early December settled over the drainage the way a heavy blanket settles over a sleeping body, not in any sudden dramatic drop, but in a slow, steady thickening of cold and silence until one morning, Stephen stepped outside with his coffee and felt, in the way the air bit at the inside of his nostrils and how the snow under his boots no longer gave but shattered, that they had crossed an invisible line into the kind of winter that did not play at being temporary. The sky had gone from a shifting sheet of pale cloud to a hard, high lid of washed-out blue, the kind that offered light but no warmth, and each breath he took left a dense hanging plume in front of his face that lingered a second longer than it had last week, as if the air were reluctant to let go of anything that carried heat. He moved more carefully now when he went out, not because he feared the cold in any immediate way he had seen worse in fire camps and on ridge tops with wind-like knives, but because he knew that what used to be a long walk had become, in this new depth of frost, a series of small wagers with the weather and his own body, each step a little bargain that said, "If I place my foot just so and keep my attention where it belongs, nothing will crack or twist or give way under me." His boots squeaked on the packed path from the cabin to the creek crossing, that thin familiar line worn by his own repetitions, and as he crossed the frozen skin of Clearwater Creek on the small log he had dragged into place years back, feeling the solid glassy ice just below, his mind was less on his balance and more on the memory of the basin in the den, the green-lit hollow where he had watched the pups tumble in Gray's stand guard. Since that day he had found his thoughts drifting back to that pocket of trees at odd moments, in the middle of splitting wood or resetting a trap, as if some small anchor he had sunk there was tugging gently at him, reminding him that there was now a point in this vast white map that meant something more than just forage or shelter or a way around a rockfall. He did not change his route to pass by it again. That would have felt like an intrusion, a kind of trespass worse than stepping onto another man's trap line, but he carried its shape in his mind, the way you carry the outline of a face you have no right to think of and cannot quite put aside. He took the upper trail that morning, the one that climbed along the shoulder of the ridge and then dropped down in a long, slanting curve toward the burn, and the open flats beyond, where he kept his heavier sets, and though his eyes moved over the land the way they always did, scanning for fresh sign, for downed trees that might have shifted under snow, for any movement that did not match the regular sway of branches in the wind, he was aware of a faint, underlying tension in his chest that had nothing to do with footing or weather. Somewhere out here, he knew, Earl was also moving, working whatever line he had carved into this country, and though backcountry etiquette said a man could not own a watershed, there were shapes in the snow now, those broad rubber-soled boot prints that felt to Stephen like fingerprints on his own tools. He hit his first trap set just after the ridge began to descend, at a narrow notch where a game trail squeezed between two boulders and funneled any passing animal into a predictable stride. And as he approached he saw, with that small drop in the gut that comes from recognizing a pattern you had hoped not to see again, that the snow around the trap had been disturbed in a way that spoke not of an animal blundering into it, but of human hands and human caution. The trap jaws were open and empty, the chain stretched and taut, the drag buried deep in the drift where something or someone had pulled it, and the small, carefully tied bundle of bait he had wired above the pan was gone, no ragged threads left hanging, just a smooth torn end where the wire had been twisted free. He crouched, ignoring the way the cold bit at his knees through the layers of fabric, and studied the marks around the set. There were the prints he expected, the small, neat tracks of marten and rabbit, the whiter, heart-shaped impressions of a lone deer that had passed by in the night, and overlaying them, in a clearer, sharper cut, the same broad-heeled rubber soles he had followed along the creek days before. The stranger, and by now, if he was honest, he knew the man's name, even if he had never watched him make these particular marks, had stepped in from the downhill side, stopped just short of the trap bed, knelt, his knees leaving deep oval depressions in the snow, then leaned in to work the wire and spring with fingers that had done this many times. Stephen's jaw tightened as he traced the path of those steps with his eyes, watching them move away, merging eventually into the faint line of a larger trail that cut across his own. And for a moment the white landscape in front of him blurred, overlaid in his mind with the cramped cabin, the orange lantern light, Earl leaning back in the chair with his mug, saying in that flat, unbothered tone that he saw wolves as money, especially if someone had pups close enough to reach with a snare. The memory struck him harder out here than it had in the moment, the words now attached not just to a man's mouth, but to a set of tracks in a practiced hand, and he felt an old familiar anger stir in him, the kind he had used to aim at bureaucrats and negligent homeowners whose carelessness had lit timber on fire. He reset the trap because not resetting it would have been, in his own private code, the same as taking his name off this piece of ground, and he was not ready to do that, not to Earl or anyone else. His fingers, clumsy in gloves, worked the pan and springs, the movements automatic from years of repetition, and when the trap was bedded and the snow smoothed over it once more, he stood and followed the stranger's tracks with his eyes rather than his feet, seeing how they bent downhill, away from his line and toward the lower trail. Toward the corridor he knew led eventually toward the denning basin and the older spruce beyond. He told himself that the turn could be coincidence, that at this time of year, most hunters and trappers in this country would naturally gravitate toward the same sheltered draws and open feeding areas, that nothing about a man walking toward thicker cover meant he knew about wolf pups in a hollow Stephen had himself only stumbled upon by accident. The thought did not sit well. It felt like one of those rationalizations he had heard from doctors and administrators, when Anne's test results had come back late or someone had misread a chart, the kind of just so story that smoothed over a rough edge without actually dulling the danger it posed. The second trap he checked that day lay farther along the slope, at the point where the trail dipped through a stand of young lodgepole pine that had sprung up after the big fire, their trunks close and straight, the space between them choked with lower limbs that caught snow and made walking through them a slow scratching affair. He could tell from 15 yards out that something was wrong here too, because the snow in the narrow corridor that led to the set had been churned more than the light dusting from last night's flurries could account for, clumped into irregular mounds that told of something heavier than a fox forcing its way in and out. As he closed the distance, he saw, with a slow spreading heat in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion, that this time the trap still lay buried under its careful bed of snow, the pan untouched, the wires and small disturbances around it undisturbed, but 10 feet beyond, right in the center of the trail, where any animal following the main line of scent would place its weight without thinking, a different trap sat, its metal newly oiled and dull, its jaws wider and heavier than his, the kind designed more for something with thick legs and a strong neck than for the smaller fur-bearers he took. It had been set with skill, there was no denying that, the chain was buried deep, the drag hidden under a small deliberate mound of snow that would look, to any passing eye, like nothing more than the natural drift that built up behind a fallen limb, and the pan had been dusted with such care that even Stephen, who had been bedding steel into dirt and snow for decades, had to squint to pick out the faint circle where the powder lay thinner. But the thing that made his throat feel tight was not the trap itself, or even the fact that it was here on ground he had long considered his responsibility, but the track that ran straight through its center, a clean, unmistakable line of large paws, the toe pad spread slightly with each step from the weight above, each impression set down exactly where any wolf, moving at a steady walk, would place its foot. He could see, in the way the snow had fallen into the edges of those prints, that they were no more than a day old, 2 at most, which meant that he was looking at a stretch of ground where Earl, because who else could it be now, with his talk of tags and bounties still echoing, had stood, read the same story written in snow that Stephen was reading. and decided to write his own answer over it in steel. The logic was simple, almost brutally elegant. Here is where the wolves go. Here is where I will wait for them. Stephen stood over the new trap, his breath puffing out in long, slow clouds that hung in front of his face before drifting apart, and felt the world narrow down to a small, sharp point that seemed to sit somewhere just behind his breastbone. The outside part of the conflict was clear enough. These were his hills, his trapline, his winter, and another man had walked in and set a piece of gear in the snow without asking, staking a claim not with words, but with iron. Yet beneath that practical anger, another layer pressed harder, the one that showed him with cruel clarity the sequence of what would happen when a wolf, maybe one of the pups grown a little, maybe Gray herself, followed this path in some night to come. He imagined the paw coming down on that pan, the sudden explosive clack of jaws, the first wild wrenching fight against the chain, the blood dark against the white, the snow around the drag chewed into red, hard, churned lumps, and then the long, thin whine that followed when panic burned down into pain. The image was not abstract. It rose out of his recent memory of the basin so cleanly that he almost saw small gray bodies where there was now only cold metal and undisturbed snow, and he had to close his eyes for a beat to clear the overlap. His own identity, the one he had carried for years, hunter, trapper, man who lived by the simple equation of work in, meat or fur out, pushed back reflexively, reminding him that he had no moral high ground to stand on here, that he had set his own share of iron teeth in dirt and snow and taken animals that had done nothing to deserve it. Beyond stepping into the pattern he had drawn for them, that the difference between weasels and wolves was, in some ways, only a matter of human preference layered over state regulations. The practical voice that had kept him alive in hard seasons said that a wolf was just another resource, that pelts might help pay for fuel and repairs next year, that the state wanted their numbers down for its own reasons and would be happy for every one earl hauled out. But another voice, quieter and stubborn, spoke up beneath it, the one that had been seated in that cold green lit hollow, when he watched Gray nose each pup in turn, and felt a flash of recognition so sharp it needed no common language. The one that whispered that knowing the inside of their small world the way he now did made him something other than a stranger passing through. He thought of Anne's words that had come back to him more than once since she died, dropped in his mind like small stones into water. There are things you do just because you know you're the one standing there when they need doing. And for the first time since he had come out here to escape the weight of other people's expectations, he felt that sentence land not as an accusation, but as a kind of map. He stood there long enough that the cold began to work up through his soles and into his ankles, gnawing at the small bones, and he watched his own breath until it slowed from quick, tight bursts into longer, steadier exhalations. The choice itself did not grow any easier with time. It sat in front of him in the snow as plainly as the steel and the paw prints, untouched by the small rationalizations he tried to wrap around it. If he stepped away and left the trap where it was, nothing would explode immediately, no one would know, and the winter would go on its course with one more hidden danger in it, set not by his hand, but by a man who had walked into his cabin under the flag of shared hardship and coffee. If he reached down and took the trap apart, twisted the dog off the pan, pulled the dragon chain, and carried the whole thing back with him, he would cross a line he had tried for years not to cross with other men's gear, because out here, touching another man's trap, was one of the few acts everyone agreed was an invitation to trouble. He realized with a kind of distant surprise that the anger he felt toward Earl in that moment was less about territory and more about the position the man had put him in, the way he had forced Stephen to stand in a clearing in the cold and hold both his own life coat and this new unwanted knowledge about wolves and decide which one he would violate. The thought that he might be overreacting, that this was exactly the kind of solitary man's paranoia that polite society laughed at when it heard stories of hermits in the hills, did cross his mind, but it flickered and died when he pictured the three small bodies again, the red-tinted pup darting at his siblings, the smallest one climbing over a shoulder only to slide off. He bent. His gloves creaked as he closed his hands around the trap's frame, the metal cold enough that he felt its bite even through the layers of fabric. And for an instant, he half expected the land itself to object, to send some omen or crack of branch, to mark the breaking of an unwritten law, but the forest remained as it had been, a hushed, indifferent bowl of snow and trees and faint, distant wind high in the needles. He set the safety on the powerful springs, eased the jaws open with the practiced leverage of a man who knew how to keep his fingers clear of sudden force, lifted the trap from its bed, shook the loose snow from it, and began to coil the chain around the frame, each loop a small final act. When it was done, he stood with the weight of the trap in his hand and looked once more at the trail, at the line of wolf prints that crossed where the metal had lain, at his own boot marks beside them, at the faint overlaying ghost of Earl's soles, and he felt, not triumph or relief, but a strange, unwieldy quiet. As if some long-standing noise in the back of his mind had dropped away, leaving behind a kind of uneasy stillness that would not let him pretend he had not just done something that would ripple outward in ways he could not yet see. He strapped the trap to his pack, making sure the chain was secured, so it would not clang against the frame and announce his passage, and turned back toward the cabin, moving more slowly now, not from the added weight, but from the awareness that the next time he sat across from Earl at his table, and he was sure, in some deep animal way, that there would be a next time, there would be something in the air between them that had not been there before, something unspoken and sharp as hidden steel under snow, and that for the first time in years, the winter ahead would not be a simple matter of wood and meat and weather, but one of choices he could not make on instinct alone. The cold came down hard in the middle of December, not as a gentle slide, but as a sudden emphatic decision from the sky that whatever mildness had lingered in the valley was over, and for 3 days the temperature did not climb above zero even at noon, the air so sharp and dry that every exhale felt like it might crack in his throat and drop to the ground in shards. Stephen felt it first in the woodpile, in how fast the neat stack dwindled as he fed the stove more often just to keep the cabin at a livable warmth, and then in his own hands, which refused to stay nimble for long even inside wool and leather. The skin along his knuckles chapping into thin narrow splits that stung whenever he flexed his fingers around an axe handle or the stock of the rifle. He watched the sky the way he watched the tree line, with the wary familiarity of a man who had learned the hard way that clouds and wind shifts could be as dangerous as claws. And on the morning the storm finally built, he had the uneasy sense, even before he stepped outside, that the light coming through the small cabin window had a different quality. A kind of thick diffuse glare that meant snow was not just falling, but being driven. The thermometer on the frame read 10 below, the red line sunk deep in the glass, and beyond it the world had blurred. The trees on the far side of the clearing reduced to faint smudges, their trunks and lower branches already half erased by a curtain of white that moved sideways as much as down. It was the kind of weather that told a sensible man to stay put, yet a line of traps ran along the far side of the burn, that he had not checked in 2 days, and in this kind of cold, anything left caught without attention for long would freeze into a waste that neither pelt buyers nor his own conscience would accept. He weighed the risk the way he had always done, putting one palm flat on the door frame, feeling the cold leaching through the wood, listening to the wind's pitch, testing his own body for signs of sluggishness that might mean he was already more worn down than he knew. He felt tired, but not beyond what a man of his age could push through, and the unease in his gut had as much to do with restlessness as with fear, the cabin's close walls beginning to feel like they were pressing his thoughts back into his skull. He dressed for it as if preparing for a fight, layering wool and flannel and canvas, pulling on the heavy parka whose hood fur had stiffened from years of breath ice, lacing his boots so tight his toes tingled before they settled into a dull, even pressure, stuffing spare mittens and high-calorie snacks into his pack alongside the small shovel and the coil of cord he always carried for emergencies. The rifle felt heavier than usual when he slung it, not because of any added weight, but because every pound now translated directly into energy he would need to burn just to keep moving through the drifts, that the wind was already piling into strange, deceptive shapes. When he stepped out onto the porch, the storm met him like a living thing, the wind pushing against his chest and legs with a blunt, insistent force that made the simple act of closing the door behind him an effort, snow whirling in chaotic spirals that stung the strip of exposed skin between his scarf and the edge of his hood. Visibility had dropped to a few dozen yards at best. Beyond that, trees and dips and rocks dissolved into a featureless, shifting gray that made the world feel smaller and more treacherous at the same time, because what he could not see he could no longer rely on memory to fill in. Paths he had walked in every season disappeared under a uniform layer that smoothed the land's character into something unfamiliar, and for the first time in a long while he felt, as he crossed the clearing and found the notch in the far snowbank, where his usual route slipped into the shelter of the trees, that he was stepping into a place that did not care how well he thought he knew it. Under the spruce canopy the wind's teeth dulled but did not disappear, working its way around trunks and through branches to send fine dry snow drifting down onto him in constant thin sheets, settling on the shoulders of his coat and the top of his pack like ash. The world narrowed further, reduced to the small circle of ground he could see in front of his boots, and the immediate patterns of trunk and branch, and he found himself counting his steps in a low, unconscious murmur, one more way to measure distance when landmarks went missing. He kept his compass in his pocket and checked it more often than Pride would have liked, knowing how easy it was, in this kind of white noise, to veer off a familiar line by just a few degrees and find himself, an hour later, in a place that did not match any of the maps in his head. The farther he went, the more the storm seemed to press into the trees, finding every gap in the canopy to drive its snow down into the understory. And the trail, which had been firm packed snow over solid ground, began to soften under his feet, the crust giving way more often, his boots plunging knee-deep into powder that grabbed at his legs, and filled the tops of his socks with cold that burned first and then went numb. His breath came harder, puffing out in thick clouds that immediately shredded in the wind, and sweat gathered between his shoulder blades under the pack straps, a dangerous damp that he knew could turn on him quickly if he ever had to stop for long. He reached the first of the traps on that side of the drainage moor by feel than by sight, his hand finding the familiar roughened bark of the leaning pine he used as a marker, his eyes picking out the faint rectangular disturbance in the snow that told him where the trap bed lay beneath. The set was empty, sprung by nothing, the pan still depressed, the bait untouched, and he reset it with hands that already wanted to fumble, cursing under his breath at the time it cost him to kneel in the drift and work metal and wire with fingers that had lost some of their fine control. The second and third sets told similar, equally unrewarding stories, and with each one he felt the worry in the back of his mind grow a shade darker, not because the traps were empty that happened, but because the light was already thickening toward afternoon, and the effort of forward motion through deepening snow had begun to eat into the reserve he liked to keep for the return journey. When the trail finally left the relative shelter of the trees and stepped out onto the low open shoulder that overlooked the burn, the storm revealed its full shape, and for a moment the sheer force of it stripped even his practical thoughts away, leaving only the raw animal sensation of being very small in the face of something vast and indifferent. The wind tore across the open ground with enough strength to lean him sideways, driving the snow horizontally, the air so thick with it that the black skeletal trunks of the burned trees appeared and vanished like ghosts, here one breath and gone the next. The horizon was gone, swallowed in a uniform wall of gray that made it impossible to tell where the land ended and the sky began, and the usual cues he used the line of the far ridge, the darker patch where the creek cut through had all been erased, wiped from the surface of his world as neatly as chalk from a board. He should have turned back then. The thought came to him clear and reasonable, a small voice in the back of his mind that sounded more like Anne's than his own, saying that no fur was worth walking blind into a storm like this that pride and habit did not keep a man's fingers from going black. Yet another part of him, stubborn and wary of giving ground to fear, reminded him that turning back now meant walking into the teeth of the wind with his tracks already half filled in, that the path home was no more certain than the path ahead, and that if he could just reach the cluster of big rocks that marked the midpoint of his line, he would at least know where he was in this blown-out white emptiness. He hunched his shoulders against the gusts and pushed on, angling his body to cut through the wind, rather than fight it head-on, counting his steps again, watching the small fleeting clues. The land still offered the faint shift in snow texture that meant a dip or a rise, the way the buried shapes underfoot changed when he crossed a fallen log. Time lost its usual markers. Everything shrank to the rhythm of lift, place, brace, lift, place, brace, and he was dimly aware, somewhere under the roar in his ears and the steady thud of his own heartbeat, that fatigue was spreading through him in a way that felt thicker and more insidious than simple muscle tiredness. The edges of his vision had begun to gray slightly, the world narrowing further, and his thoughts, usually clear even when his body suffered, started to come slower, as if someone had packed them in wool. He knew enough about hypothermia to recognize the pattern the way your body, pushed too long in cold and wind, started to pull its resources inward, leaving your hands and feet clumsy and your thinking just a little off, and the recognition brought with it a bolt of sharp-focused fear that cut through the haze like a knife. He stopped walking, not because he wanted to, but because his legs decided, almost on their own, that another step without a plan would be a step too far, and he stood hunched in the screaming whiteness, snow plastering the front of his coat, ice forming along the edges of his scarf where his breath had frozen, and forced himself to look around, really look, past the immediate misery for anything in the landscape that could be turned into shelter. There, half a dozen yards to his right, barely visible as a darker, uneven lump against the general blur, lay the twisted mass of an old blowdown, a spruce that had gone over in some past storm, and now lay with its roots torn up and its limbs half buried, the exposed root mass forming a shallow curved wall, the tangle of branches and snow at its base, creating a kind of ready-made hollow. He stumbled toward it, breaking through drifts that grabbed and held his legs, and when he reached the lee side of the root ball, the change in the wind was immediate and almost shocking, the roar dropping to a muffled rush, the snow no longer driving into his face, but swirling more lazily in the small pocket of relative calm. He dropped to his knees and clawed at the loose snow under the arch of the fallen trunk, scooping it out with bare hands once his gloves became too clumsy, the skin on his fingers burning with cold, as he scraped down to frozen ground and needles, widening the hollow enough that he could wedge himself inside. The work warmed him a little, sending heat back into his limbs, and when at last he wriggled into the cramped space, pulling his pack in after him and using it partly as a backrest, he realized with a mix of gratitude and dread that this might be the only thing standing between him and the kind of slow, quiet ending he had sometimes, in darker moods, imagined accepting. The storm continued to rage just beyond his little pocket of earth and wood, a constant pounding presence, but in the hollow its force was filtered, turned into a heavy, distant sound like surf, and he could hear his own breath again, harsh and uneven in the narrow space. He shrugged out of the pack, pulled his spare mittens on to cover his raw fingers, and fumbled with the thermos in the side pocket, until he managed to unscrew the top and drink a few mouthfuls of lukewarm coffee, the liquid hitting his stomach with a spreading warmth that felt almost indecent in its suddenness. He knew he could not stay there forever. The shelter would keep the worst of the wind off and buy him time, but it would not magically refill the woodpile at the cabin or bring the thermometer up, and at some point he would have to stand up again and walk into whatever remained of the storm. For now, though, the immediate urgency receded enough to make room for thought, and in that cramped, dim hollow, with snow pressing all around him and the rough, cold weave of the tree's root mass at his back, his mind did what minds do when the present is too sharp, it slips sideways. He pictured, with a clarity that surprised him, the narrow hospital bed where Anne had lain, her skin almost the same color as the sheets, the monitors humming and beeping, the window showing a sky not so different from the one outside now, hard and empty, and he remembered the cold that had lived in him then, a different kind of cold, deeper and less negotiable. That had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the knowledge that there was no shelter he could build against what was coming. He thought of Lily, whose last winter had never really been a winter because the hospital's climate control kept everything at the same bland temperature, and of how he had told himself, after they were both gone, that he had withdrawn to these hills not to chase death, but to sit outside of everyone else's life, to exist in a kind of holding pattern where nothing new could be lost, because nothing new would be let in. Now, hunched under a fallen tree with his toes tingling in his boots and the skin on his face stinging and the storm roaring around him, he felt the edge of a bitter irony that after all his careful arrangements to be away from the world, he might still simply vanish, his body folded into some drift miles from the cabin, found in spring by elk or not found at all. And the list of people who would notice his absence would be short enough to count on one partially numb hand. The thought should have depressed him, and in some way it did, a heavy ache in his chest, but there was something else in it too, something like a question, cold and clean, about whether that was really all there was, whether he was willing to let his story taper off in a hollow like this, without even the courtesy of a last deliberate step in some direction other than away. He found, to his own quiet surprise, that in the small inventory of who or what might be aware of his passing, the image that rose first was not of his brother in town hearing the news months later, or of some Forest Service contact filing a report, but of a gray shape at the edge of a basin, ears pricked, eyes bright, turning her head at the faintest scent of something missing along a familiar trail. He did not know what to make of that, and the storm gave him no time to figure it out, because the cold was working its way back in now that the brief flush from the coffee had faded, and he could feel his muscles beginning to stiffen in the cramped position. Staying was as dangerous as leaving. The hollow was a pause, not a solution, and he understood, with the practical part of him that had built this life and kept it going, that if he let himself slide any further into stillness, the urge to lie down and stay would grow, and that urge, in this kind of weather, was the real predator. He shifted, gritted his teeth as pins and needles flared in his feet when he moved them, forced his numb fingers to close around the pack straps again, and backed himself out of the hollow, the sudden hit of wind and snow on his face like a slap. The world outside had not softened, if anything. The storm had intensified, the flakes bigger now, the gusts more savage, but there was a difference in him, a small hard knot of intention where before there had been mostly routine and habit. He set his compass again, fixing the cabin's direction not as a vague hope, but as a line he meant to walk, and as he turned his back on the hollow, he felt, in some deep animal corner of himself, that he had just stepped away from more than one kind of grave. The return was a blur of effort and small stubborn choices, each step a decision to lift his foot one more time, rather than let it sink and stay, and when, much later, he finally saw the faint familiar shape of the cabin, through the thinning curtain of snow, its roof and walls half swallowed by drifts, his relief was so strong it came out of him as a rough involuntary sound. Something between a laugh and a sob lost at once in the wind. He crossed the clearing on legs that felt like someone else's, stumbled once on the step, caught himself on the jamb, and shoved the door open with his shoulder, spilling into the dim, blessedly still air of the single room. The warmth hit him like a physical blow, even though the stove had banked low in his absence, and as he slammed the door shut against the storm and leaned his back against it, chest heaving, snow melting and dripping off his coat onto the floorboards, it took him a few long seconds to realize that the snow on the porch had not been as smooth as it should have been, if no one had come calling while he fought his way back. There had been a subtle flat and area just in front of the threshold, a place where drifts that should have built into soft natural shapes were instead pressed into a shallow rectangular depression, the kind made when someone stands for a while in one spot, shifting their weight from foot to foot as they decide whether to knock or turn away. The storm broke in the night as abruptly as it had risen, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and thin, the stars so sharp and bright above the ridge that when Stephen stepped out to bring in more wood before dawn, he had the strange sense that he was walking under glass. The air was brittle, the kind of dry cold that made the inside of his nose crackle, and his eyelashes gather tiny crystals, but after the howling chaos of the blizzard, there was a peculiar peace in the stillness, a silence so deep he could hear the tiny shifts and creaks inside the cabin walls behind him as the logs adjusted to the temperature. He slept heavier than usual after his fight back from the blowdown hollow, dropping into a black, dreamless pit the moment his head hit the rolled jacket used as a pillow, and when he had finally woken, hours later than he meant to, his body had that slow bruised feeling of something that had been beaten and was not yet sure it would not be struck again. Even so, habit drove him, and once the first heavy mugs of coffee had chipped a crack in the fog behind his eyes, he was sliding into his boots and shrugging into his coat, the memory of the depressed snow on the porch, nagging at him like a stone in his shoe. He paused at the threshold before stepping out again, looking down at the patch of snow, where he had noticed the extra flatness the night before. In the dark and his exhaustion, he had only registered it as wrong. Now, in the thin gray morning light, he could see more. The drift in front of the door had been worn into two shallow side-by-side troughs, the size and spacing just right for human boots, and at their lower end, where the feet would have been, the snow had been ground a little deeper, the faint scuff signature of someone who had stood, perhaps shifting weight, perhaps just bracing against the wind. No clear tread pattern remained, the storm had done its work there, blurring edges and filling hollows, but the shape was unmistakable. He stepped over it as he left the porch, feeling the faintest twitch in his shoulders at the idea of another man standing exactly there, facing his door, maybe listening for sounds within. There was no way to know for certain that it had been Earl, but his mind furnished the image so readily, the narrow, weathered face with its washed-out eyes, the worn parka, the way those hands had turned his spare mug slowly on the table, that it barely seemed like speculation. His chest tightened in that familiar, irritated way, not full anger yet, more a building pressure, and he found himself glancing at the tree line, as if expecting to see someone stepping out from behind a trunk, cap in hand, to explain himself. Nothing moved. He turned up the trail toward the burn, because work did not wait for puzzles, and if the storm had brought anything into his traps that he could use, he needed to get to it, before the meat froze beyond saving or the fur was ruined by scavengers. The snow underfoot was different now, thicker and looser, piles and hollows where the wind had sculpted it into waves and ridges, and walking demanded a kind of attention he usually reserved for more obviously dangerous tasks, every step probing for depth and footing, his calves burning as he pulled his legs free again and again from drifts that tried to hold them. The forest had that post-storm hush that always felt to him a little like the silence after someone has finished shouting in a small room, a careful quiet in which every sound seemed to check itself before stepping out. His own progress sounded loud in his ears, the soft thud of his boots, the brush of his pant legs against snow and low branches, the faint creak of leather, and as he moved, he became aware, with that extra sense you develop only after long years in country like this, that the land around him was not entirely still. Somewhere ahead, to his right, something large was moving through the trees, not close but not far, the kind of presence you felt through subtle changes in the birds' calls, in the way the wind shifted around trunks, in the faint, carrying trace of disturbed snow. He slowed without quite deciding to, his hand adjusting the way it rested on the rifle's sling, and veered slightly off his usual line to climb to a small rise that gave him a view down into the shallow draw beyond. As he reached the top and eased himself behind the shaggy cover of a spruce, he saw what his body had already guessed at, a set of tracks cut clean through the new snow, fresher than anything else on the slope, the edges still sharp, the powder inside them undisturbed by drift. The prints were large, heavy, spaced in a long, steady stride wolves, and not one or two, but many, a line of paws that moved together up the draw, fan-like where they had spread out at a fork and then converged again when the path narrowed. He watched the empty draw for a moment, listening, but the pack was already elsewhere, the silence they left behind feeling almost as present as their passing had been. When he dropped back down to the main trail and crossed their path, he paused, crouched, and laid his gloved hand near one of the prints, measuring without touching. Gray's mark, if he remembered right, had looked much like this, wide, confident, sunk deep from the weight of her, and he wondered, not for the first time, if he would ever be able to distinguish her specific track from those of her kin, or if that was just another human conceit, the wish to put a name to something wild so that it felt more knowable. The pack's line moved up toward the ridge and then cut left, away from the basin and toward the old spruce stand, where the ground lay uneven from some long-ago homestead, timbers sunk under snow, the shape of human habitation, now nothing more than a subtle change in how the forest grew. He filed that knowledge away with the rest, another thread in the pattern, and continued on toward the open edge of the burn, where he had left several of his heavier traps set before the storm. The first two sets he checked were empty, jaws open, pans untouched, the snow around them holding only the light tracks of small birds that had hopped about in the thin sun that followed the blizzard. It was at the third, a spot favored because the line of the old fire had left a kind of natural funnel between a clump of surviving trees and a rocky outcrop, that he saw the color. At a distance, the patch of red seemed almost unreal, too vivid against the vast broken field of white and black, like a piece of cloth someone had dropped. As he closed the ground between them, stepping down through the crust into softer, deeper layers, the shape resolved itself into something painfully familiar and wrong at the same time. A wolf lay in the snow just beyond where he knew Earl's larger trap had been placed days before, its body twisted in the awkward, half-collapsed angle of something that had fought hard, and then suddenly, absolutely stopped. It was a young animal, not a pup anymore, but not yet filled out to adult mass, its legs long and thin, its ribs still faintly visible under the thick winter coat, the fur a mottled blend of gray and cream and tan that would have been beautiful in another context. The trap held its foreleg just above the paw, the heavy jaws sunk into fur and flesh, blood clotted around the metal in a dark, stiff mass that had frozen into a rough collar. The snow immediately around the body was torn up, thrown into sharp, irregular mounds where it had thrashed and lunged against the chain, each mark a wordless record of pain, and farther out, scattered in a rough circle, drops and streaks of blood, had painted the white in a pattern that his mind, despite itself, tried to read as an accusation. The wolf's lips had pulled back as it died, exposing its teeth in a rictus that, to someone searching for symbols, might have looked like a snarl, but Stephen knew enough anatomy and enough death to see the muscle contraction for what it was, the last involuntary clenching of jaws when everything else had already gone slack. Its eyes, half open, had clouded to a dull, lifeless film, catching no light, and the small patch of tongue visible between its teeth had frozen in a dull blackened curl. He stood over it, the cold filtering slowly through the layered anger in his chest, and felt, more than thought, the wrongness of the whole tableau. Not because he had never seen an animal caught and killed in a trap he had, many times, and had caused it himself, but because he had watched this pack in life now, seen their easy playful cruelty on each other as pups, their wary grace as adults, and putting this stiff, blood dark shape together with those memories, felt like taking a photograph of his daughter and holding it beside a clinical description of a disease. The pieces belonged to the same story, but the jump between them was too jarring to take in at once. The trap itself told him things he already suspected, the way the chain had been anchored, the make and model of the steel, the small nick on one jaw where it had once closed on rock. It was the same style he had lifted off the wolf trail days back, the same kind Earl favored, and the thought that this was what he had tried to prevent then brought with it a dull, useless sense of being late, like a firefighter arriving to find a house already sunk to its foundation in embers. He might have stayed there longer, turning in place, reading the tracks around the kill, if another pattern had not caught his eye, the prints of at least two men, maybe three. The tread deeper and more varied than a single pair of boots would leave, moving in around the wolf's body and then away again toward the far side of the open. There were other signs, too, a cigarette but half buried in the snow, its paper stained brown, and the end frozen into a small, ugly icicle, the flattened scar where someone had set down a heavy pack, a rough boot-scraped patch of ice where a man had braced himself to drag something. He turned his head and saw the drag marks leading off toward the line of trees, two parallel troughs cut into the snow where a slet or a makeshift travois had bitten, and in that moment any lingering doubt might have had about whether Earl was working alone evaporated. This was not the tidy solitary work of one careful poacher. This was a small operation, a crew, men who had planned and hauled and smoked and laughed out here in his winter, in his quiet. The realization carried a different flavor of unease than the simple anger at a single trespasser. A lone man could be confronted, argued with, maybe even scared off if you picked your words and your distances right. A group, especially one that had already decided his drainage was a source of money, was a different animal. They would have their own stories to tell about why they were here, their own grievances and justifications, and somewhere in those stories he would be, whether he liked it or not, as the guy in the cabin who either looked the other way or did not. He followed the boot prints with his eyes until they vanished into the darker tangle of the far tree line, not ready to walk after them yet, then looked back at the dead wolf, at the stiff line of its body, at the hole in the snow where its missing leg had been pressed during its struggle. A part of him, the practical part that had packed out countless animals from these hills, considered whether he ought to salvage the hide, make use of what was already done, but the idea of laying hands on this particular body, of cutting and pulling, felt like stepping into someone else's story in a way that made his skin crawl. The fact that someone else was Earl only complicated it. Taking the pelt would be theft in the eyes of the men who had set the trap, and the last thing he wanted was to add property to whatever was already brewing between them. He stepped away instead, and as he did he noticed something just beyond the churned circle, a smaller track, lighter, pressed only once into the snow and then gone, as if whoever had made it had hovered at the edge of that bloody patch, and then retreated. It was another wolf print, similar in size to the dead ones, but the angle of the toes, the slight inward slant, suggested an animal that had approached slowly, cautiously, nose working, perhaps touching the frozen flank of its packmate once with a cold, uncertain muzzle before turning away. The idea of that silent visit, of a living wolf standing where he now stood and looking down at this same mess of steel and fur and red ice, lodged under his breastbone with a painful little twist. He was still standing there, the storm-clean sky a hard pale bowl overhead, when he heard the crunch of boots behind him, distinct even through the soft deadened sound of his own movement. He did not start. Something in him had been expecting this, the way you expect the second half of a sentence, once you know how the first part goes, and he turned slowly, enough that the sling on his rifle did not snag, to face the man coming up the slight slope. Earl climbed with that same compact, efficient gait Stephen had noticed the first time he stepped onto his porch, his parka zipped high, his cap pulled low, his gloves dark with use. Another man trailed a few paces behind him, younger, broader through the shoulders, his face half hidden by a scarf, and a third figure moved farther down, closer to the tree line, head bent as if he were checking something in the snow. Earl's gaze flicked once to the carcass, then back to Stephen, and there was no surprise in it, only a kind of calm calculation, as if he had walked up on exactly the scene he expected. "Hell of a thing, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the dead wolf, his voice carrying easily across the short distance between them in the cold air. "Storm like that, you figure nothing's moving, but business doesn't stop just because the sky's mad." Stephen held his eyes, saying nothing at first, because whatever words he chose next would begin to write the shape of whatever lay between them from here on out. The wind tugged at the edges of their coats and sent small plumes of loose snow skittering around their boots, and for a moment the world felt reduced to the four of them and the frozen animal on the ground, the rest of the valley a blank, watching presents that offered no guidance. "Looks more like your storm was waiting on them," he said finally, the words slow and flat, no heat in the tone, even though he could feel plenty of it under his ribs. "You set steel right where they walk. Didn't need much help from the weather." Earl's mouth quirked in something that might have been appreciation for the observation, his eyes never leaving Stephen's face. "That's what you do if you know what you're about," he answered. "You read the ground, you see who uses it, and you make that work for you. Same thing you've been doing with mink and cats all these years from what I can see." The equating of his own line with this bloody circle made the muzzles in Stephen's jaw jump, but he kept his voice even. "Mink don't run in packs and take down calves and yearlings," he said. "They don't howl outside people's houses and spook their kids. There's a difference." Earl shrugged, a small economical lift of one shoulder that seemed to say he had heard such distinctions before, and filed them under personal preference. "Difference is mostly in how folks talk about them," he said. "Man back in town loses a couple calves, he doesn't cry over mink. He calls his brother-in-law and asks if anybody's willing to take a tag or two. Wolves are just another line item in that ledger. You take one, you save some beef, you get paid. Everybody sleeps a little easier." Stephen thought of the den, of the pups tumbling in that sheltered hollow, of Gray's eyes locking onto his through the branches, and the phrase "everybody" caught in his throat like a piece of gristle. He knew, in some rational part of himself, that cattlemen, ranchers, the folks down in the valley, had their own calculus of loss, their own stories of animals gone in the night, and bank accounts thinning, and that to them, a dead wolf in the snow was not a tragedy, but a relief. Yet out here on this patch of ground, with this particular body at his feet, the math refused to add up so neatly. "You working this alone?" he asked, though the answer stood behind Earl in boot and breath already, because some stubborn piece of him wanted to hear the man name his numbers. "Or are you bringing in a whole crew to make sure nothing with fur gets out of here alive?" The younger man behind Earl shifted his weight, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps just impatient, but Earl's expression did not change. He glanced back briefly, taking in his companions with a quick sweep, then looked at Stephen again. "Couple of us from over the ridge," he replied. "Folks talk, you know how it is. Word gets around there's a good pack up here. Tags go cheap if you know who to ask. Be foolish to leave that kind of money standing on its feet, especially in a winter like this with feed costs doing what they are. You've been here long enough to know all that." What Stephen knew, as clearly as he knew the feel of an axe handle in his hand or the sound of a creek under ice, was that this man saw the land and its inhabitants as a balance sheet, and that any sentimental weight Stephen might attach to den scenes or quiet exchanges of breath on a cold morning had no place in that accounting. He also knew that this conversation was drawing a line under something that had already, in effect, been decided the moment he lifted Earl's trap off that wolf trail, and that each word now either hardened or blurred that line. "I've been here long enough to know that once you start seeing everything that moves as a dollar sign, you stop seeing much else," he said, hearing his own father's bluntness in his tone and not entirely minding it. "You set on running the whole pack out." Earl looked past him then, toward the slope where the wolves' tracks had climbed earlier, his eyes narrowing slightly in the glare off the snow. When he spoke again, his voice stayed calm, but there was a faint steel thread running through it that had not been their over coffee in the cabin. "I'm set on doing what I came here to do," he said. "I don't have a problem with you running your little line, long as you don't have a problem with me running mine. But if we start stepping on each other's iron, taking each other's catches, that's when things get messy, and like I told you before, neither of us is young enough to enjoy messy." He paused, then added, almost gently, "You understand me." Stephen thought of the trap coiled in his shed now, silent testimony to the fact that he had already stepped on Earl's iron in the most literal way possible, and for a heartbeat, a flicker of primitive fear moved through him, the kind that cared less about right and wrong than about the image of himself on the wrong end of some dark misunderstanding in the woods. But alongside it, stronger now than it might have been a month ago, rose the memory of his gloved hands, lifting that trap from the wolf trail, the sense, afterward, of an inner noise quieting as if he had finally aligned some long-off kilter piece of himself. He met Earl's gaze steadily. The words he might have said about lines, about leaving the wolves alone, about this being his winter and his valley jostled behind his teeth, but he held them back, not out of fear, but because he understood that there was no sentence he could shape here that would change what kind of man Earl was or what he had come to do. The choice in front of him was simpler and heavier than that, whether to bow his head and move his traps further up some side draw, pretending they were just two professionals sharing ground, or to hold his piece of moral terrain, knowing it might cost him. He did not answer Earl's last question with words. The silence between them lengthened, filled with the faint hiss of wind over snow and the distant crack of a tree adjusting to the cold, and in that silence Stephen felt something settle in him, a decision that had in truth already been made back when he lay in the snow above the den, and watched small gray bodies wrestle in a circle of light. The sound came just before first light, at that gray hour when the world is neither night nor morning, when the cabin seems to float in its own small circle of cold air and darkness, cut off from whatever slow rearrangements the forest has been making in the dark. Stephen lay half awake on the bunk, one arm thrown over his eyes to block the faint glow of embers in the stove. His body still heavy from the previous day's trudge up to the kill site and back, when the howl rose through the floorboards and into his bones, so long and level, and unlike the hunting calls he had grown used to, that it snapped him into full awareness. Before he had even parsed its tone, it started low, a rough vibrating note that seemed to come not just from one throat, but from the frozen ground itself, then climbed, stretching out in a thin, almost broken line that trembled at the top, and then fell, not cleanly, but in a series of small choke drops, like a voice cracking. He had heard wolves call to one another across drainages, had listened to their sharp, urgent volleys when a kill was close or an intruder needed to be warned off, but there was something rawer in this cry, a flavor of panic and refusal that made the hair on his arms rise under the blanket. He lay still for a few heartbeats after the sound faded, waiting to see if it would be answered, if the valley would ripple with reply, but the silence that followed was thick and absolute. Somewhere inside that quiet, his decision had already been made. By the time he swung his legs off the bunk, the rest of him was simply catching up. The cabin's air was cold enough that his breath smoked as he pulled on his pants and wool shirt, his fingers clumsy with haste, as he fumbled with buttons that had never given him trouble before. He did not bother with coffee, did not take the time to stack more wood into the stove, just grabbed his coat and jammed his feet into his boots, lacing them with quick, rough pulls that left the knot a little crooked, then reached for the rifle out of habit more than intention, slinging it across his back as he stepped out into the pre-dawn. The sky over the ridge was a deep bruised blue, the first hint of day a faint bleaching along the eastern edge, and the snow in the clearing reflected that color so completely that the world seemed made of shades of steel. The cold was severe, but he barely registered it beyond the way it made his lungs ache, when he drew in a deep breath to listen for another sound, standing on the porch with his head cocked, his eyes automatically searching the black line of trees for a movement. The second howl came from the north, across Clearwater Creek, and up toward the old spruce stand, where the ground was uneven from whatever had once been built there. It was shorter this time, more jagged, as if the throat that produced it were raw now, and beneath it, Stephen thought he caught, or imagined he caught, a thin high thread of sound that wasn't quite a howl at all, more like a whimper magnified by distance and cold. He did not waste time triangulating. His body had already turned, his boots already taking the steps down from the porch and across the clearing, his legs finding a pace that walked a line between urgency and the careful placement winter demanded. The snow had settled into a dry, squeaking crust over powder that was still loose beneath, and his steps broke through just enough that each motion sent a small spray of crystals up around his shins, the cold creeping in through the gaps at the tops of his boots. He crossed the frozen creek where it narrowed between two rocks, his boots skidding for an instant on the slick, glassy surface before his weight carried him up onto the far bank, and then he was in the trees, the spruce closing around him in a dark, dense wall, their branches low and heavy with old storms. He moved up the slope toward the sound, letting instinct and the faint pull in his chest guide him more than any conscious knowledge of the land's contours, though some part of him recognized, with a small jolt, that the line he was taking would carry him close to the basin and, beyond that, to the tangle of roots and sunken shapes he had noticed beneath the snow weeks earlier. As he climbed, the air filled with the smell he had come to associate with the pack, a sharp, musky tang that cut through resin and cold like a blade, stronger now, layered with the faint iron of blood and the sour, almost sweet reek of fear. The third cry was not a full howl at all, but a rough broken series of sounds that seemed to crack in the middle, rising in pitch as if forced through a throat that could not quite carry them. They came from just ahead and a little below him now, and when he pushed through a dense stand of young fir, their needles scraping at his coat, he almost stepped out onto the lip of the problem, before his brain fully registered what his eyes were seeing. The ground in front of him dropped away in a sudden abrupt cut, a circular depression 3 or 4 yards across and at least 10 feet deep, its walls sheer in places and undercut in others where snow had slumped, the bottom a churned mess of exposed earth, ice, and dark-rotted timbers that he recognized with a sick lurch, as the remnants of the old root cellar he had half noticed earlier in the season. The heavy crust of snow that had formed over it had apparently looked solid enough for running paws. Now it lay in jagged slabs at the bottom, broken by the weight that had punched through. In the middle of that chaotic bowl, 3 small shapes moved, or tried to move, scrambling against the slick sides and sliding back down, their claws scrabbling uselessly at frozen dirt and beams. Big, larger than the others, was up, his shoulders already heavier, leaping in short, frantic bursts toward the wall, each jump ending in a desperate clawing that threw loose chunks of earth and ice down onto himself and the others. Rusty, the red-tinged pup, paced in small, tight circles, his usual restless energy turned now into panic, his head lifting every few seconds as he gave that thin, high whine that had threaded through Gray's calls, his ears flattened, his tail tucked so tightly it seemed to have disappeared. The smallest of them, the one Stephen had privately dubbed third in his mind, lay half on his side near one of the broken timbers, his flanks rising and falling shallowly, his fur dusted with snow and heaped with finer powdery crystals that had settled and begun to freeze into his coat. At the edge of the pit, so close to the drop that her front paws slid a little with each anxious step, Gray circled and circled, her body a taut curve of muscle and intent, her head lowered, ears pressed back. Every few seconds she would lean in, front legs braced, muzzle extended, teeth bared in a soundless snarl at the empty air, as if she could intimidate the sheer sides of the pit into letting her pups go. Once she tried to jump, bunching her hindquarters and launching herself toward the bottom, but her weight barely carried or 2/3 of the way down the wall, before gravity and slickness sent her sliding back, claws leaving thin white scratches in the frozen dirt. She landed heavily, staggered, shook herself, and went back to circling, eyes flashing wild in the cold light. Stephen stopped dead at the tree line, his boots sending a fine trickle of snow over the lip of the pit. Gray's head snapped up, her nose working once, twice, and then her eyes locked onto his with a force that felt physical. The distance between them, no more than 2 long strides, seemed to vanish. All that remained was the space held by their 2 bodies, and the ragged edge of the world's skin beneath their feet. The fear that came then was not the vague background awareness of sharing space with a predator he had felt before. It was immediate and hot, the kind that flushed the back of his neck and made his fingers tingle, because he was close enough now to see the size of her head, the width of her jaw, the gleam of her teeth when her lips curled back, the sheer power in the muscles that bunched along her shoulders as she turned to face him squarely. Instinct howled at him to back away, to put more trees, more distance, more anything between himself and that raw, focused desperation. But beneath that, cutting through it like the clean edge of ice on rock, was the sound of the pups, the thin weakening whines from the bottom of the pit, and the sight of Third's small chest heaving more shallowly now, his paws twitching feebly against the timber. Fear of Teeth had to fight, in that fraction of a moment, with the newer, stranger thing that had been growing in him all winter, the knowledge that he was, at this exact second, the only creature in reach with the hands and tools to change what was about to happen. He lifted his empty hands slowly, palm out, fingers spread, in a gesture that was less a deliberate signal than an instinctive admission of having nothing in it. The rifle stayed on his back, the weight of it suddenly irrelevant. Gray's eyes flicked to the movement, then back to his face, her body lowered a fraction, her stance angling, not quite a charged posture yet, but the kind of coiled readiness that said she could be on him in less than a heartbeat if she chose. Easy, he heard himself say under his breath, knowing the word meant nothing to her in the way he meant it, yet unable not to speak it, as if sound itself might bridge something. His voice came out hoarse, scraped raw by cold and the rush up the hill, and the air stole most of the breath from his mouth before it reached any ears but his own. His eyes roved the immediate scene, faster now, looking for anything that could be turned into a way down and back up. That did not involve his own body tumbling uncontrolled into that mess of timber and ice. Near the edge, half buried under drifts, he saw what he needed: the tops of old fence rails, or perhaps the remains of the root cellar's support beams, laid out decades ago and now sunk into the hillside, their ends protruding from the snow like the bones of a long-dead animal. He moved sideways, slow and deliberate, every small shift of his boots sending little slides of snow down into the pit, and Gray tracked him, hackles raised, her breath billowing in white plumes. He bent and brushed snow away from the closest rail with his gloved hands, exposing rough, weathered wood that creaked but did not crumble when he tested it with his weight. It was long, maybe 8 or 9 feet, thick enough to bear a man's pull, and when he levered one end up out of its bed, the other followed reluctantly, shedding clumps of packed snow and frozen dirt. The sound of it scraping free made the pups flinch, Rusty pressing himself against Big in a sudden frightened spasm, and Gray reacted with a low guttural growl, her head swiveling between Stephen and the bottom of the pit, as if trying to decide which threat to address first. He dragged the rail to the lip of the pit and laid it down, lowering it hand over hand until one end rested against the churn bottom and the other angled back toward him, the whole length forming a makeshift ramp that cut through the air like a thin, precarious bridge between two impossible positions. The wood shifted as it settled, sending a small shower of frost and powder down onto the pups. Big yelped once, more in shock than pain. Then, in the next breath, his pupils narrowed in recognition, or at least curiosity, flickered across his expression. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The rail lay there, slightly canted, the grain of its old splintered surface catching the thin light, and Stephen felt the seconds stretching out in a way that made the skin on the back of his neck itch, as if some invisible clock had started counting down the moment he wedged that wood into place, and he was already losing. Then Big moved, drawn by some combination of instinct and the simple fact of a new structure in his small, terrible world. He slunk forward, shoulders low, tail tucked, and sniffed at the base of the rail, his nose touching the damp wood, his breath making small clouds that clung to its surface for a second before vanishing. "Come on," Stephen murmured, the words slipping out without conscious thought, his knees bent, his hands gripping the top of the rail hard enough that his fingers ached. Come on, you stubborn thing. Big shifted his weight, put one paw onto the rail, then another, his claws clicking faintly on the frozen grain, and began to climb, more scrabble than smooth ascent, his body sliding sideways each time he lost purchase, his hind legs pushing hard against the pit's floor. Twice he nearly fell off, catching himself with a frantic twist and claw, and each time Stephen felt his own stomach lurch in sympathetic motion, his muscles tightening as if he could somehow lend strength through the wood. Gray watched, her entire being focused now on that small struggling body, her growls muted to a soft, constant rumble that seemed less a warning and more a vocalization of pure, helpless urgency. When Big reached the last foot of the rail, his front paws found the crumbling edge of the pit, nails digging into the packed snow there. Stephen lunged forward, then, dropping to his knees, his gloves scraping into granular ice, as he leaned down and seized the pup by the scruff with one hand, the matted fur hot under his fingers compared to the air, the skin loose and stretchy the way young animals often were. Big jerked once in alarm, twisting his head to snap weakly in Stephen's direction, but before fear could turn into a bite, Stephen had hauled him up and over the lip, his other hand catching a rear leg and swinging the animal clear of the drop. He set him down a couple of yards back from the pit on solid ground between two small firs, keeping his own body between the pup and Gray without fully intending to. Big stumbled, shook himself hard enough that snow flew off in a small glittering cloud, then staggered toward his mother, who met him halfway with an intensity that made the breath catch in Stephen's throat, a flurry of sniffs, licks, low, chuffing sounds that had the cadence of scolding and relief braided together. She nipped his shoulder once, not hard enough to hurt, just enough to assert something, and then her gaze snapped back to the pit, as if the successful retrieval of one target had only sharpened the point of the next. Rusty had retreated to the far side of the hole during Big's climb, pressed into the angle where wall and collapsed timber met, his body trembling, his eyes white-rimmed. The rail now lay closer to him than before, its base sunk a little deeper into the churned mess, and when Stephen dragged it to adjust the angle, it slipped, the lower end skidding sideways in the slush. For a second the whole length teetered, threatening to drop completely to the floor of the pit, and he had to throw his weight onto the top, his boots braced against the snow to keep it wedged. "Come on, kid," he said under his breath, the words forced out between clenched teeth as he wrestled the wood back into a workable position, his shoulders burning. "This is your shot." Rusty did not come at once. Twice he started toward the rail, only to skitter back, his back legs sliding in the muck, his tail plastered under him. The third time, something changed, maybe the angle of Gray's head above, maybe the small weak movement from Third lying motionless in the corner, maybe simply the exhaustion of fear, and he took the few shaky steps, nose low, ears nearly flat to his skull, and put his paws on the wood. His climb was worse than Big's, his lighter frame working against him, each scramble gaining him inches, only to see him slip halfway back. Stephen held the rail steadier this time, his weight better placed, but his arms shook under the strain, the muscles in his forearms bunching and burning, his breath coming faster from the effort. Rusty's claws left thin bright lines in the frost on the rail, his body flat and almost completely against it in his attempts to cling, and once he hung suspended for an awful second, all four legs splayed as the rail shifted under him, before he managed to hook a paw over a knot in the wood and lever himself up another few inches. When his head finally reached the level of Stephen's boots, he froze, eyes huge, nostrils flaring at the scent of this towering, strange animal looming over him. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, and in that brief contact Stephen saw, not some mythic wildness, but the simple raw terror of a young thing that has no context for the hand reaching toward it. He moved slowly, bringing his fingers in under Rusty's chest, feeling the rapid hammer of his heart through the ribs, and lifted, the pup light in his grip, compared to the weight of his own gear. Rusty wriggled once, a single convulsive motion, then went limp in his hands, his body collapsing into a tense, trembling bundle, as Steven set him down beside Big, who nosed and jostled him as if to reassure himself that his littermate was real. Gray lunged forward as Rusty touched ground, her head thrusting past Steven's shoulder close enough that he could feel the heat and damp of her breath through his coat, as she took her second child into her mouth, gripping him gently across the shoulders, lifting and setting him down again as if checking each limb, each joint. Her flank nearly brushed his arm, the coarse hair grazing his sleeve, and the instinctive flinch that wanted to pull him back collided with the practical knowledge that any sudden jump might spook her in a way that would send teeth, not muzzle, into his flesh. He forced himself to stay still, every muscle rigid, and after a few more frantic sniffs and licks, she moved away a step, Rusty leaning against her front leg, both of them panting clouds into the cold. Only third remained. Steven looked down into the pit, and for a second his vision blurred, whether from cold, exhaustion, or something else he could not have said. The smallest pup lay where he had been, only slightly shifted by the fall of snow and debris during the other rescues, his body curled in on itself, his head resting awkwardly against a splintered beam. His sides still moved, but barely, the rise and fall so shallow that Steven had to force himself to watch for long enough to be sure he wasn't imagining it. Frost had formed along the edges of his whiskers and ears, tiny delicate spikes that gleamed faintly in the growing light, and there was a stillness in the line of his limbs that spoke of cold, that had sunk deeper than surface. He knew in that practical, backcountry part of his mind that the rail would not be enough this time. Even if Third woke enough to try and climb, his muscles would not respond. Whatever heat had left was going into keeping his heart and lungs going, not firing the fine motor of paws and claws. If Steven wanted this one out of the pit, he would have to go down himself. For a moment the thought made his body revolt. Climbing into a hole like that in winter, a 10-foot drop into unstable snow and rotten timber, with a panicked wolf mother at the edge, was the kind of risk he would have, in any other context, dismissed as idiotic, the sort of thing that got men listed in spring reports as found deceased, cause of death, probable fall. The walls could slough under his weight, the old beams could shift and crush a leg. Gray could, at any second, decide that whatever truce they had built in the last few minutes was too fragile to bear this new insult, and come for him. Then the pup made a sound, so faint he almost missed it, a tiny breathy whine, more exhale than voice, that nonetheless traveled up the cold air and brushed his ears like the lightest of touches. It was not a noble cinematic cry for help. It was the simple sound of a small freezing body protesting its own failure. His right hand went to the zipper of his coat almost of its own accord, tugging it down, so that he could open the heavy fabric like a curtain. With his left, he tested the edge of the pit, pressing his boots into the snow to find purchase, planning the angle of descent not as a climber going for style, but as a man counting ways to minimize how many bones might break if everything went wrong. Gray stiffened as he moved closer, her body angling, her teeth flashing once in a sharp warning snap that cut the air inches from his shoulder. He felt the wash of her breath against his neck and tasted wolf scent, hot and rank, and every nerve in his back screamed at him to retreat. He did not. Last one, he muttered, whether to her himself he could not have said, and then he was lowering himself over the edge, his boots feeling for the first jut of timber, his hands gripping the cold crumbling wall. The pit smelled of damp earth and old wood and the dense animal musk of the pups, overlaid now with the metallic tang of fear, and the faint sourness of urine and feces, the body's involuntary responses to terror. His feet slipped once on a patch of ice, sending his chest slamming into the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of him, and for a second his fingers scrabbled in the frozen dirt, finding nothing. Then his boot found another beam, the edge biting into the sole, and he stopped sliding, his arms burning as they took his weight. He dropped the last few feet more than climbed, letting gravity take him once he judged he was close enough, landing awkwardly on one knee in the churned mess of snow and timber. Pain shot up his leg, a white-hot streak that made his vision narrow, but he rode it out, sucking in a breath that felt like glass, and then he was moving, because the one thing he did not have down here was time. The walls loomed above, the sky a small ragged circle, and at the lip he could see the dark outline of Gray's head, her ears forward, her body tense, her claws digging into the snow as she shifted her weight, torn between the urge to back away from this enclosed trap-like space and the compulsion to get as close to her trapped pup as possible. He crossed the few steps to third in 3 strides, his boots slipping on ice but carrying him forward, and knelt, ignoring the protest from the leg he had banged. Up close, the pup looked even smaller, his fur clumped in damp patches where snow had melted and refrozen, his eyes half closed, rimmed with a thin crust of frost. Stephen slit his hands under the limp body, feeling the shocking cold of the little ribs and belly, the faint weak flutter of a heartbeat against his palm, and lifted him, cradling him against his chest. The pup weighed almost nothing, he could feel each bone through the skin, the fragile architecture of a creature that had not yet had time to put on the full armor of adulthood. Without thinking too much about symbolic anything, he tucked third inside his open coat, pressing the small body against the worn wool of his shirt, against the heat that still radiated from his own core. The shock of cold fur against his bare chest made him hiss, but then, slowly, he felt a different sensation spread the smallest tentative nudge of movement as the pup's muscles, given a hint of warmth, tried to remember their job. He zipped the coat as far as he could with one hand, trapping the little bundle against him, and turned back to the wall. Climbing out with both hands free would have been a chore, doing it with one arm effectively glued to his side was something else entirely. He planted his boots, found the same beam he had used to descend, and began to haul himself up, his fingers digging into frozen earth, into splinters and rough seams in the wood, his breath harsh and loud in the confined space. Once his foot slipped and his body swung, his shoulder slamming into the wall, sending a shower of snow and dirt down into his face. Third gave a small muffled sound inside his coat, not quite a cry, but enough to tell him that the impact had traveled. At the lip, his hand shot out and grabbed the top of the rail, his fingers closing on the rough, splintered edge with a grip that had nothing elegant in it, only brute determination. For a terrifying fraction of a second, his boot lost its hold completely, and he hung, suspended by his fingers and the precarious friction of his other leg against the wall, the full weight of his body and the small budding warmth in sight, his coat dragging at his shoulder. Then something in him, some quiet, stubborn refusal that had been building all winter, surged, and he pulled, his muscles screaming, his teeth bared in a silent snarl that matched any Gray had thrown at him. Hands grabbed him. For a wild heartbeat, he thought, impossibly, that it was the wolf herself, that those long, powerful jaws had closed on his collar, but the grip was human, rough, gloved fingers hooking under his arm, wrenching him up and over the edge with a force that was as much momentum as strength. He tumbled onto the snow, rolling away from the pit in a clumsy, sprawling motion that left him on his back, gasping, snow caked into his hair and beard, his heart pounding so hard it shook his chest. He twisted, half expecting teeth, claws, something, but Gray had not come for him. She stood a yard away, her whole posture stretched toward his midsection, nose working furiously at the front of his half-zipped coat, her eyes wild and fixed. The helping hand, that brief, unexpected shove on his arm, had been his own. He realized a second later, a last desperate self-jerk that his brain had framed, in its oxygen-starved shock, as external aid. He fumbled with the zipper, his fingers numb and clumsy, and opened the coat just enough for a small gray head to push out, eyes blinking slowly in the cold air. Third's nose twitched, his breath a faint shaky puff, and for a moment he simply rested there, half in Stephen's warmth, half in the winter, suspended between two states. Then Gray moved, faster than he would have thought possible on the slick snow, and her muzzle enveloped the pup, teeth closing with exquisite gentleness around his shoulders, as she lifted him free of the human's chest and set him down in the hollow between her front legs. She went to work on him with a ferocity that had nothing to do with aggression, licking, nudging, pushing him with her nose, rolling him slightly, her tongue rasping through his fur in long, vigorous strokes that both dried and stimulated. Under her ministrations, he twitched, coughed once, a tiny wet sound, and then took a deeper breath, his small body shuddering as some inner engine caught and turned over. Big and rusty crowded clothes, their own noses prodding and sniffing, their tails now out from under them, wagging in short restrained arcs that betrayed their confusion and relief. Stephen lay where he was, propped on one elbow, feeling the bite of the cold through the thin sweat-dampened wool of his shirt, now that his coat gaped open, watching the cluster of gray bodies in front of him. His hand shook, not entirely from chill, and every muscle in his arms and shoulders throbbed with that deep, satisfying ache that comes when a body has been pushed right up to its limit and held there. For once his mind did not leap ahead to consequences or back to past failures, it simply sat with the sight, the sound of small horse whines, the smell of wolf and breath and thawed fur in the cutting air. After what might have been seconds or minutes' time had gone strange on him somewhere between the first howl, and now Gray lifted her head from third and looked at him. The expression in her eyes was not readable in any human terms he trusted. It was neither gratitude nor forgiveness nor any of the other words people like to plaster over animals' faces when they told stories. It was a long, steady look, heavy with something like recognition, as if she were adjusting some internal map that had previously drawn him only as a danger. They held that gaze for a span of heartbeats that felt oddly outside of the rest of his life, the valley around them silent, except for their breathing and the distant faint creak of trees in the cold. Then, without any theatricality, she turned, nudged each pup into motion, and began to move away into the trees, her gait unhurried but purposeful, the three small bodies stumbling and hopping at her heels. Snow brushed off branches as they passed, falling in small pillows that briefly obscured them, and then they were gone, swallowed by the dark trunks and the crooked pale light between them. Stephen remained on his knees beside the ragged mouth of the pit, his hands resting on his thighs, his coat hanging open, the bite of the air finally reaching the core heat that had been shielded while third pressed against him. His breath came in visible bursts, each one a small private claim on the cold morning. He looked down into the hole one more time, at the broken snow and exposed beams, at the space that, a short while ago, had held three small lives on the edge of erasure, and had somehow, by a chain of choices he had not planned but had made anyway, failed to claim them. His fingers, stiff and red, began to tremble then, and he was not sure if it was from the cold or from something else entirely. The days between the pit and Earl's next visit slid by in a way that felt both slow and oddly weightless, as if time had been knocked off its usual track and was now running along some slightly altered groove. On the surface, Stephen's routines looked much the same. He cut and hauled wood, he checked and reset traps, he kept the stovepipe clear of creosote, he patched a split in the water bucket with a sliver of pine and a smear of pitch. Yet each familiar motion carried, tucked inside it, the echo of that long hoarse howl in the pre-dawn and the rough, cold weight of Third's small body pressed against his chest, and the valley itself seemed to hum with a different tone, as if some barely audible chord had been added beneath the usual winter silence. He saw less of the pack after that morning, at least directly. Their voices still rose sometimes at night, but the pattern of the howls changed. The big chorus calls that had once rolled across the drainage from the direction of the first then shifted, appearing now from farther up the ridge, their angles different, their echoes bouncing off different bands of rock and timber. When he crossed the basin again a few days later, more out of a need to know than any hope of seeing them, the hollow where the root cellar had collapsed was empty. The sharp scent of wolf faded to a faint memory. The only new marks in the snow a few cursory tracks that skirted the pit at a wide distance, as if the land itself had been relabeled in their minds as dangerous. He crouched at the edge of that hole, looking down at the broken beams and churned earth, the traces of his own boot marks already softened by fresh dustings, and tried to imagine the logistics of moving 3 pups, one still shaky across this terrain in winter. He pictured Gray lifting them one by one in her mouth, their bodies dangling, their paws drawn up tight, her own legs breaking through crust and drifts as she carried them, perhaps with another adult wolf running flanking cover, perhaps alone. The thought left him oddly hardened. Whatever other pressures the valley might throw at them, they had, at least, the instinct and strength to start again somewhere the ground was more trustworthy. Back at the cabin, life contracted as the year's end approached. The days were short now, light on the snow, thin and bluish even at noon, and he found himself spending more hours inside, the walls closed, but not as suffocating as they had been earlier in the season. There was a new presence in that small room, one that had nothing to do with ghosts, intruders, a kind of quiet he had not felt in himself for a long time, not the dull, numb quiet of depression, but a more alert stillness like a pond after the wind has dropped, its surface reflective rather than churned. He caught himself, more than once, sitting at the table with a mug in his hands, staring at nothing in particular, while scenes from the last weeks replayed in no particular order Anne's face in the dim hospital light, Gray's eyes above the pit, Earl's worn hands curled around his spare mug, Lilia laughing on the porch in a summer so distant it might have belonged to someone else. The difference now was that these images did not all come with the same sharp punishing bite. The memory of Anne's warning about trusting his ret on people had begun to feel less like a reproach and more like a piece of practical advice he had finally started to follow. On the 5th day after the rescue, when the year was leaning into its last week and the snow outside had settled into a deceptive softness that hit a treacherous crust beneath, he heard boots on the porch again. This time there was no storm howling around the cabin, no blizzard to scramble sounds and swallow shapes. The approach was clear, the crunch of compressed snow, the muted thump of a boot heel on the step, the brief pause before the knock. He had been standing by the stove, coaxing a reluctant piece of birch to catch, and his body went still the moment the first footfall reached his ears, every muscle tightening as if bracing for an impact. The memory of the flattened patch in front of the door from days earlier flickered through his mind, layered over the new sound, and by the time the knuckles rapped on the wood, 3 measured blows, his jaw had already set into a line he recognized from mirrors in years past. He did not rush to answer. He set the poker down with unnecessary care, wiped his hands slowly on his pants, giving himself those few extra seconds that can make the difference between speaking from a flinch and speaking from a place just solid enough not to topple. Then he crossed the short distance to the door and opened it. Earl stood there, framed by the pale cold light, his parka zipped high, a crust of frost on his eyebrows and beard, his breath making a steady, unhurried plume with each exhale. He looked much as he had the first time, same boots, same worn cap pulled low, same rifle angled with its muzzle toward the ground in that practiced, non-threatening way, but there was a subtle difference in his posture, a kind of contained focus, as if he had rehearsed this visit in his mind and was now stepping into it with the intention of seeing it through. "Morning," he said, his tone easy but not quite casual. "Figured I'd see if you were still breathing after that blow we had. You weren't around yesterday when we passed by." Stephen felt the small private satisfaction of realizing his guess about the flattened snow had been right, but he did not show it on his face. "Still breathing," he replied. "Come in. It's colder out there than it looks." Earl stepped inside, stomping his boots lightly on the mat to shed snow, and took in the cabin with the same quick, comprehensive glance as before. his gaze noting the small changes, the extra wood stacked near the stove, the trap leaning in the corner, cleaned and coiled, that did not match Stephen's usual gear. If he recognized his own steel in that shape, he chose not to comment on it immediately. He removed his gloves, flexed his fingers, and accepted the mug of coffee Stephen poured him, wrapping his hands around it with obvious appreciation. The air in the cabin felt heavier with another body in it, the combination of their breaths and the stove's heat, thickening the small space, and Stephen became acutely aware of every small sound, the tick of metal as the stove expanded, the faint drip of melted snow from Earl's coat hitting the floorboards, the tiny, barely audible clink as Earl's mug met the table. They talked, at first, about the things men in their position always talked about when they did not yet want to talk about the real matter, the storm's path, the way the wind had cut down trees along the ridge, a minor slight Earl claimed to have seen on the far slope, a small praise for the way Stephen's cabin had held up under the load. It was a dance of sorts, familiar and oddly courteous, each man giving the other a chance to show weariness, annoyance, humor. But underneath the words, something taut pulled tighter. After a while, Earl set his mug down, the gesture deliberate, and leaned back slightly in the chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. His eyes, pale and steady, fixed on Stephen's face in a way that stripped the room of its minor distractions. I came by for more than weather talk, he said, and there was no pretense in the statement. Figured it was time to lay things out straight. See if we can't both walk into the rest of this winter, knowing where we stand. Stephen nodded once, a small acknowledging dip of his chin, and stayed silent, letting the other man choose his opening. You've seen the signs same as I have, Earl continued. Big pack working this drainage, good size animals. You don't need me to tell you what that means, in terms of what the state's paying and what folks down in the valley are wanting gone. You also know, from the looks of it, that we've already started thinning them. He said we without apology, without any attempt to dress the word up or down, and the image of the young wolf in the snow, leg clamped in his steel, flickered behind Stephen's eyes with such clarity that he could smell the frozen blood again. What I'm thinking, Earl went on, is that there's no reason this has to be a pissing match. You've got eyes on this place, lines already laid. Knowledge I don't have yet about exactly where they move. I've got tags, crew, buyers lined up. We put that together, we both walk out of here at the end of the season with our pockets heavier and this ridge a little quieter. You don't have to like what we're doing, but you'd be smart to cut yourself in. There it was. The offer, neat and practical, framed not as a threat, but as an invitation to be reasonable, to share in what could be seen from a certain angle as necessary work. Earl's expression did not change as he spoke. His tone stayed level, almost conversational, and that calmness, more than any hint of bluster, made the room feel smaller. Stephen felt, as the words washed over him, the old reflex rise, the one that had carried him through years of fire crews and bureaucracy, the habit of making himself smaller at the table, nodding along externally while his real thoughts retreated a step, the sense that saying no outright to someone else's plan would mark him as difficult, as a problem, rather than a helper. That reflex had served him in crowded offices and briefings out here in this thin-walled cabin with the snow pressing in on every side, and the echo of a pup's fading whine still lodged somewhere near his sternum. It felt like a betrayal. He took a breath, tasting coffee and smoke and the faint tang of cold still clinging to Earl's clothes, and let his gaze rest for a moment on the small scarred tabletop between them, the scratched wood worn smooth by years of use. When he lifted his head again, some of the old flinch had gone out of him. I'm not cutting in, he said. The words came out on one line, not rushed but not hesitant either, and hearing them in his own voice surprised him with how right they sounded. I'm not leading you to them. I'm not helping you run them out. For a second something flickered in Earl's eyes, not shock exactly, but a shift, as if a card he had expected to play cleanly had snagged on the edge of the table. He did not immediately scowl or raise his voice. If anything, he grew a shade stiller. You got some special fondness for wolves I should know about? He asked, the question shaped lightly but with a hard little core inside it. Last I checked, they weren't much in the way of companions. They won't thank you for leaving them be. Hell, they'd take your dog, your deer, same as anyone's. Stephen thought, briefly, of the way Gray had looked at him after the pit, that long unreadable stare, and the tiny practical gifts of cooperation his mind could imagine the pack taking down diseased elk that might otherwise weaken the herds, the way predators cleaned a system as much as they stressed it, but he did not reach for any of that. It would have sounded like argument, like trying to convert Earl to a different faith, and that was not what this moment was about. It's not about them thanking me, he said. It's about what I can live with when I go to sleep in here at night. He gestured a slight tilt of his head toward the bunk. I took one of your traps off their trail. I pulled 3 pups out of a hole they weren't getting out of on their own. That's the track I'm on now. You do what you're going to do, but I'm not walking you to anyone's den. The announcement that he had removed Earl's trap lay between them like a small sharp object, its presence undeniable now that it had been named. Earl's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at that, the muscle along one side bunching for just an instant before smoothing out again, and Stephen saw, with a clarity that might not have been available to him before Anne's death, the moment when the other man's view of him shifted from solitary neighbor with quirks to obstacle. You know what that is out here, Earl said, his voice still quiet but flatter now, some of the earlier easy cadence stripped out, stepping on a man's iron. Taking it, might as well walk into his house and start pulling boards off his walls. Folks don't usually do that unless they're ready for what comes after. I know what it is, Stephen replied. I also know what it would have been, letting it sit where it was. We're both picking our trouble. There was a stretch of silence then, long enough that the tick of the stove expanding and the soft hiss of a draft through a tiny gap in the chinking grew loud in their own small ways. Earl's gaze did not waver, but something in it turned inward, as if he were running quick calculations behind his eyes, weighing profit against cost, pride against practicality, the value of pressing this conflict now against the benefits of waiting to see whether winter or chance might do his work for him. At last he pushed his chair back, the legs scraping lightly on the floorboards, and stood, setting the empty mug down with a care that felt deliberate, the porcelain touching wood without a clink. That's how you want to play it, he said. The words were not a question. You make your choices. Just understand I'll be making mine. Wolves don't live forever. Neither do men. Only difference is men get to decide what they stand on before they go. He reached for his gloves, slid them on, each finger pushed into place with brisk, efficient motions, then pulled his cap down a little lower on his forehead. At the door he paused, one hand on the latch, and looked back over his shoulder. Shame, though, he added, his tone returning for a moment to that almost friendly register it had held when they first shared coffee. A winter's a long time to spend with only ghosts and your conscience for company. Having company in the flesh, even the kind you argue with, isn't the worst thing. Stephen did not answer that. There were a dozen retorts on his tongue about the quality of company, about the weight of certain kinds of quiet, but they all felt either petty or too grand for this small room. Instead, he simply met Earl's eyes and let whatever was in his own gaze stand in for words. Earl opened the door, and a blade of cold air cut into the cabin, making the flame in the stove's belly flare and dance. Snow light flooded the narrow space between them for an instant, casting both men's faces into a stark, almost colorless relief, and then he stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft final click. The cabin reclaimed its stillness in the wake of his departure, the sound of his boots on the porch fading, then disappearing altogether as he moved into the snow-muted forest. Stephen stood where he was for a long moment, his hand still resting on the back of the chair Earl had vacated, feeling the warmth the other man's body had left there slowly seep into the air. A part of him, the old part that hated open conflict, quailed at the knowledge that he had just turned a potential ally into a certain adversary, that the next time he saw those washed-out blue eyes, they might not have even this much courtesy in them. Another part, newer and quieter, exhaled. Later that day, after the light had strengthened and his own thoughts had settled enough that he could trust his feet not to wander from the path his compass and memories set, he climbed toward where the old den had been. Not out of any real hope that the wolves would still be there, the shift in their howls had told him they were not, but because he needed to see the absence with his own eyes. The basin lay under a fresh coat of snow now, the pit's ridges softened, the dogs and his own footprints blotted. The marks of his desperate descent and ascent turned into nothing more than subtle irregularities in a white field. He stood at the edge a while, listening, the only sounds the faint groan of trees in the cold and the distant knock of a woodpecker somewhere downslope. The air held no sharp musk of wolf anymore, only the clean dry scent of winter. If he closed his eyes, he could almost convince himself that the den, the pup's gray stare, had been a dream stitched together from hunger and solitude. Then, as he turned to leave, a small incongruous shape on the narrow game trail that led back toward the cabin caught his eye. Lying in the snow, perfectly placed in the center of the path where no one could miss it, was half the carcass of a jackrabbit, the cleanly severed back end, hind legs still attached, fur fluffed white with frost. It was not torn and scattered the way leftovers from a kill usually were. There were no random bite marks, no ragged edges. The break was neat, almost deliberate, as if whatever jaws had done the work had measured the division. There were tracks around it, wolf prints, several sizes, but no sign of scavengers having picked at the offering. It had been brought here and left, not dropped, not forgotten, but placed, the body aligned with the direction of the trail, facing toward his cabin. He stood over it, the cold air burning in his lungs, and felt the laugh rise in him before he knew it was coming, a short breathy sound that steamed in the freezing air and carried more astonishment than humor. He could not say, and never would, exactly what intention lay behind this strange grisly gift, whether it was simple surplus, the pack leaving a portion of their kill on a convenient path, or some dim echo of reciprocity written in bone and instinct, rather than gratitude and language. It didn't matter. What mattered in that moment was the way his mouth shifted at the corners as he looked at it, the unfamiliar, almost rusty feeling of his own face arranging itself into a smile that did not hurt. By March, the cold had lost some of its sharpness, trading the dry knife-edge air of deep winter for a softer, heavier chill that carried moisture in it, the kind that seeped into clothes and wood and bones alike. The snow around the cabin no longer held its perfect brittle crust all day. By late morning, a thin wet sheen formed on the surface, and when Stephen stepped out to the woodpile, his boots sank a little deeper with each visit, the top layer slumping and collapsing under his weight into slush that clung and sucked at his soles. The thermometer still drooped low most mornings, but the light had changed, gaining a clarity and length that made the valley feel, for the first time in months, like something other than an ice-bound world without edges. The sounds changed, too. Where there had been only the dry hiss of wind and frozen needles, and the occasional crack of a tree complaining about the cold, there was now the irregular wet tapping of meltwater dripping from eaves, from the ends of spruce boughs, from icicles that had hung on the cabin's shaded side all winter and were now thinning to clear, delicate shards. On sunny days, a faint, almost medicinal smell rose from the snow itself, the scent of crystals softening and releasing whatever they had trapped for months. And beneath that, more subtly, the first hint of earth, not the rich, loamy odor of true spring, but a weak, damp whisper of soil and old leaves starting to wake under all that white. Inside, the cabin had shrunk around the idea of departure. Stephen's gear, which had expanded to fill every corner during the long enclosed weeks of midwinter, now drew back toward the center, collected and sorted into piles that made sense only to him, traps cleaned and oiled and nested in one canvas bag, cooking and repair tools in another, clothing rolled tight and secured with lengths of cord. He would never waste on knots he didn't trust. He moved through this quiet dismantling of his winter life with a mixture of relief and a vague, unexpected reluctance, his hands folding and stowing items he had cursed back in November when they took up space, now touching them with a small, almost unconscious care. He had done this 8 times before the end of season pack up, yet this year each object seemed connected to some thread of the months behind him in a way it had not been in earlier winters. The extra wool shirt he had used to wrap the photograph of Anne and Lily came out of the drawer with its usual background weight, but when he unwrapped it, the picture itself no longer hit him with the sharp breath-stealing stab it had in past years. The image was the same Anne's half-squinting smile, Lily's sticky upraised hand clutching a melting popsicle, but something in him had changed around it. The pain was not gone, it never would be. It had simply been joined by other newer images that now lived alongside it instead of beneath it. Gray's eyes over the edge of the pit, Third's slight cold breath against his chest, the neat line of wolf prints curving away from the old den towards some new hidden home. He stared at the photo for a while at the small table, the noon light falling through the window in a bright square that made the paper's edges glow. He let memories surface, Anne's laugh filling their kitchen, Lily's small feet drumming against the back of his car seat, the weight of his wife's hand in his as a doctor, spoke in that careful measured tone and did not flinch away from them. The ache was there, but it sat differently now, less like an open wound and more like a scar that sometimes pulled when the weather changed. After a time, he slid the photograph back into its flannel wrap, and this time placed it not face down in a drawer, but inside the inner pocket of his coat, where it would ride with him down out of the hills. Leaving day came on no ceremony. He woke before dawn, as he always did, to a cabin that felt emptier than usual, not because the woodpile was low or the stove had gone cold, but because the corners no longer held as many small familiar shapes, the extra pair of boots already lashed to his pack, the roll of spare wire taken down from its nail, the line of coffee tins reduced to the last, half-empty one on the shelf. He lit the lantern for the final time, more out of habit than necessity, brewed a pot of coffee, and drank it slow, letting himself linger over each swallow in a way he rarely allowed when there was work to do. He stepped through the cabin once more after that, checking for what he might have forgotten, running his hand briefly along the bunk frame, peering into the corners he had long ago cleared of mice, lifting the stove's lid to make sure no burning embers remained that could start an unattended fire. When he was satisfied, he banked a small clean pile of ash in the stove, more symbol than utility, and closed the iron door, the latch clicking shut with a sound that felt, in that moment, more final than any words he could have spoken. Outside, the sky had taken on that clear, almost painfully bright blue that March sometimes brought to the mountains, a color that looked warm and was anything but. The snow in the clearing sagged at the edges, slumping away from rocks and logs where the sun had kissed it, and here and there narrow, dark tongues of earth had begun to show through near the bases of trees, like early punctuation marks on a page still mostly blank. He hauled his pack onto his shoulders with a practiced shifting motion, feeling the straps bite into his coat, and then settle as he adjusted and readjusted until the weight sat where it belonged. It was heavy, but it was an honest heaviness, the kind that made his legs acknowledge each step but did not feel oppressive. He took one last look at the cabin, its log walls dark against the snow, the stovepipe a simple crooked line against the sky, and felt that small familiar pang, the one that had come every year as he turned his back on this rough, inconvenient structure that had become, in its own way, more home to him than the house in Whitefish. Then he started down the trail. The first stretch of the walk was an exercise in watching his feet. The snow had gone unpredictable. One step would land on firm compacted crust that bore his weight without complaint. The next would punch through up to his knee into cold grainy mush that grabbed at his boots and made his thigh muscles fire hard to pull free. Meltwater had found its way onto the trail in places, thin rivulets that trickled down from under drift and refroze overnight into slick glassy patches that his soles had to respect. Clearwater Creek, which had been a silent, solid ribbon under snow for months, now spoke in a new voice as he approached, a faint tinkling music of water slipping over and under ice, the surface broken in spots where dark cold pools showed through. He crossed at his usual place, the log bridge still holding firm, though its top was damp and slick now, the bark darkened by thaw. On the far bank, the trees thinned slowly, opening up to longer stretches of sky, and he felt with each step the psychological shift that always came when he moved from the intimate, secretive world of his winter drainage into the broader, more exposed landscape that led eventually to the gravel road and the small town beyond. The air smelled different down here, less resin and ice, more of distant wood smoke and, faintly, the vague, indescribable tang of other humans going about their days somewhere out of sight. He walked for hours, his body falling into the kind of rhythmic, steady exertion that left room around the edges for thought, without inviting the kind of free-floating worry that came when he was idle. His mind drifted, not just backward over the winter over the blizzard, the den, Earl's calm threats, the jackrabbit in the snow, but forward as well, in small cautious increments. He thought of the town, the grocery store with its two bright lights, the rack of newspapers by the door, the clerk who knew him only as the quiet man who came in with a list and exact change, the small rental house where his brother had said could stay if he wanted, the couch he would have to share with a plant that had outgrown its pot. He could almost see himself there for once, not as a ghost passing through, but as a man sitting at a table, answering the occasional question without feeling that each word cost more than it was worth. The weight on his back shifted as he moved, thumping in a familiar counterpoint to his steps. The photograph in his inner coat pocket, flat against his chest, warmed slowly with his body heat, and the awareness of its presence rode with him, neither oppressive nor exactly comforting, just there like a small steady hand on his sternum. He was less than a mile from the tree line, in the last long open stretch before the road when he felt it that prickling along the back of his neck that had nothing to do with wind or cold, the sense that eyes rested on him from somewhere just beyond his peripheral vision. It was a feeling he had learned to trust more than most of his thoughts, the product of years spent in places where your skin often registered company before your mind did. He slowed, not dramatically, just enough that his breathing eased, and let his gaze drift, not snapping his head in any one direction, knowing sudden movements could change whatever was willing to reveal itself. At first he saw only what he expected, the uneven mottled line of the forest edge ahead, where spruce and fir gave way to a narrow strip of cottonwoods along a small side creek, the snow-covered meadow between them and him, its surface dimpled by the faint remains of deer tracks and the more recent marks of a single man heading out maybe a week before. The sky above that line of trees was a washed, clear blue, the sun hanging low but bright, its light slanting across the field in long, thin beams that cast the shadows of the trees onto the snow in bands of deep, cool blue. Then his eyes caught a shape that did not belong to trunk or branch or rock. She was standing at the very edge of the forest, just inside the first line of shade, where the dark of the trees met the glare of the open, her body half in, half out, as if she had stepped forward and then thought better of it. Gray, her coat thick and full, stood with the easy, steady balance he had come to recognize, her legs straight, her head held level, her ears pricked, her tail hanging in a relaxed, neutral line behind her. The distance between them could not have been more than 30 yards the length of a small field, the reach of a strong throw. In another life, with another rifle, it would have been a comfortable shot. He stopped. The pack was not with her, at least he saw no other bodies moving in the shadows behind, no extra set of eyes catching the light. It did not mean they were not there. Wolves knew how to disappear into trees and terrain in a way humans rarely managed. But in that moment, for all he could see, it was just the two of them and the thin stretch of snow between. The snow in the meadow lay in a smooth, unbroken sheet, the top layer softened by the day's mildness into something that reflected the sky so strongly it looked almost blue, crisscrossed only by the long diagonal shadows of the trees behind Gray. each line a band of cool that cut the field into stripes. His own tracks, the series of paired depressions he had been leaving all day, ended a few steps back, marking his point of hesitation, and he was briefly, absurdly aware of how clearly this would read to anyone who came upon it later. A man walking out of the hills, stopping in the open for no apparent reason. He did not reach for the rifle. The thought of doing so did not even make the first instinctive twitch in his muscles. The gun felt heavy and irrelevant on his back, a tool for another day, another task. His hands hung loosely at his sides, the gloves dark against the snow, and he kept his body still, allowing his breath to slow until the steam rising from his mouth thinned. From this distance, Gray's eyes were not just neutral glints. He could see the shape of them, the way the fur around them formed subtle patterns that made or expression look, to human perception, like something between curiosity and assessment. He knew better than to project human motives onto that gaze, but he also knew that whatever her mind was doing, it was focused entirely on him now. They stood like that for what felt like a small pocket of time carved out of the larger flow, a handful of seconds perhaps longer, neither moving, the space between them filled only by light and cold and the faint distant ticking of meltwater from the trees. He felt an urge, absurd in its impossibility, to say something aloud, to acknowledge in words the strange tangle of shared moments that had led to this standing. The howls outside his cabin, the den, the trap he had removed, the pit, the rabbit on his trail. He did not. There was nothing to be gained by feeding human language into this exact fragile line. At last, almost imperceptibly, she shifted her weight. The motion was small, a redistribution of mass from one leg to another, but it carried with it a decision. She turned, not with a startle or a leap, but with a smooth, unhurried twist of her body, her paws placing themselves with the same economical care they always had, and walked back into the trees. Her tail stayed level, her head low but not pressed, and in a few steps the trunks and shadows swallowed her, the gray and white of her coat, blending into the forest patchwork, until he could no longer pick her out. Stephen stood there a little longer, watching the spot where she had been, the echo of her presence lingering in the way the air felt, in the way his own skin seemed to remember being under that gaze. He did not know whether she had recognized him as the same figure from the basin and the pit, whether wolves' memories stitched such narratives together, or whether he had simply been, to her, one more human silhouette in a landscape that had seen too many. He did not know if that last look had contained anything like the weight he felt in it, or if that weight was entirely his. What he did know, standing there with his pack on his shoulders and the road somewhere ahead, was that whatever meaning he drew from that moment was his to carry. There would be no confirmation, no neat, satisfying line under the winter's numbers that said this is what it all added up to. Nature did not issue certificates of moral completion. The wolves would go on, or not, according to pressures far beyond his reach. Earl would make his choices, the weather would flip its own coins, spring would come later early on its own timetable. He took a breath, deep and slow, filling his lungs with cold that still had teeth in it, but no longer felt like a threat aimed directly at him. Then he adjusted the straps on his pack, feeling their rough fabric bite into the padding of his coat, and stepped forward. His boots broke the smooth skin of the meadow's snow, each depression a small temporary wound that would soften and fill as the day warmed, and as he walked, the cabin and the den and the pit and even the glimpse of gray at the tree line folded themselves into a single elongated memory that would travel with him, whether he wanted it to or not. The line of trees thinned, the last shadows fell away, and the valley opened, spilling its accumulated cold and silence out ahead of him, toward the thin ribbon of road and the small human world beyond. He did not quicken his pace, there was no need. For the first time in a long time, he felt no urge to flee one place for another, no desperation to outrun what he carried. The weight was their grief choices, a winter's worth of ghosts and fur and iron, but it sat on him differently now, balanced, as if his spine had finally learned how to hold it. He walked on,